Chapter 1. Broken Promises. Ruby Collins stood before the small, speckled mirror in her rented room, smoothing the fabric of her new calico dress with trembling fingers. The blue flowers scattered across the cream background had caught her eye in the mercantile weeks ago, and she'd saved every penny from her mending work to purchase the material. 3 nights of sewing by lamplight had produced a garment far prettier than anything she'd owned before, a dress worthy of an engagement announcement. 23 years, she whispered to her reflection. 23 years of waiting, and tonight everything changes. The April evening breeze drifted through the single window of her room above the millinery shop, carrying the scent of spring blossoms and the distant sounds of Gold Hill coming alive for the social. Somewhere down the dusty main street, a fiddle played an early tune, coaxing folks toward the town hall. Ruby pinned the last wayward strand of chestnut hair into the simple but elegant arrangement she'd practiced for days. The style framed her heart-shaped face to advantage, drawing attention to her wide hazel eyes and the natural bloom in her cheeks. She needed no rouge or powder, a blessing, as such luxuries were well beyond her means. As she reached for her mother's cameo brooch, the only heirloom she possessed, Ruby caught sight of her figure in the mirror and hesitated. The dress, despite her careful measurements, clung to her curves in a way that might raise eyebrows. She'd inherited her mother's generous bosom and hips, a figure that had always attracted sidelong glances and whispers behind fans. Ruby had overheard the less charitable ladies of Gold Hill referring to her as overly endowed and inappropriately shapely for a respectable girl. Nonsense, she told herself firmly, pinning the cameo at her throat. Edwin chose me knowing full well how I'm made. Edwin Porter. The name still felt strange when paired with her own. Not Edwin and Ruby, in the way of sweethearts who'd grown fond through courtship, but Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Porter, in the formal way of a business arrangement. For that's what it was, in truth, a practical merger. He needed a wife who could mind his books and present a respectable face to his customers. She needed security and a position that would allow her to provide for her father in his declining years. Love wasn't part of the bargain. Ruby had made her peace with that. At 23, with no dowry and a crippled father to support, romantic notions were luxuries she couldn't afford. Better a marriage of convenience to a successful merchant than the uncertain future that loomed before her otherwise. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Ruby, are you decent, girl? It's nearly time." "Yes, Pa, come in." Daniel Collins eased the door open, his right leg dragging slightly, a permanent reminder of the mine collapse 3 years past that had claimed his livelihood and nearly his life. Once among the most respected prospectors in the county, her father was now reduced to odd jobs and the charity of former colleagues. The proud set of his shoulders remained, though lines of pain etched deeper around his eyes with each passing month. Tonight, however, those blue eyes brightened at the sight of her. He'd polished his worn boots to a respectable shine and brushed his Sunday suit until the threadbare patches were scarcely noticeable. His graying beard had been neatly trimmed, and he'd slicked back his thinning hair with pomade that smelled faintly of bay rum. "Would you look at you?" he said softly. "Pretty as a Sierra sunrise, huh?" Ruby smiled, though her heart ached at the emotion in his voice. "Mama's brooch brings me luck. I thought she should be with me tonight somehow." Daniel cleared his throat. "She'd be proud, Ruby girl. Not of you marrying Porter's boy, she'd have had plenty to say about that match, but proud of how you've managed since she passed, taking care of an old, broken-down miner while keeping your head high. Pa, don't. You're not. Hush now." He patted his pocket, producing a small paper-wrapped package. "Managed to put aside a bit from the Henderson's fence repair. It's not much, but a bride should have something new besides her dress." Ruby unwrapped the paper to find a pair of simple lace gloves, delicate but practical. "Oh, Posh!" She blinked back tears that threatened to ruin her careful preparations. "They're beautiful. Can't have my girl showing up at her engagement with rough hands." He took one of her hands in his own work-hardened palm. "These have seen too much scrubbing and mending to please high society." Ruby slipped on the gloves, thinking of the calluses they would hide. badges of the hard work that had kept them fed since her father's accident. I don't give a whit what high society thinks. Daniel's weathered face creased in a sad smile. That's why I worry, girl. The Porters care for nothing else. Ruby busied herself with her shawl, avoiding her father's concerned gaze. They'd had this conversation too many times. Edwin isn't like his mother. He values practicality. That's why he chose me. I can help with the store accounts, free him to expand the business. A man should choose a wife for more than her skill with numbers. And a woman in my position should be grateful for any respectable offer. Ruby's voice was sharper than intended. She softened it with effort. It's a good match, Pa. I'll have security, and you'll have a proper home as you age. No more leaky roof or drafty walls. Daniel sighed, recognizing defeat. If you're certain, then I'm with you. He offered his arm. Shall we go show Gold Hill what a Collins is made of? Ruby took his arm, steadying him as they navigated the narrow stairs down to the street. Mrs. Wilson, the milliner who had rented them the room at a reduced rate, called good wishes from her shop as they passed. The evening air carried the promise of summer, wildflowers dotting the hillsides beyond town in bursts of yellow and purple. Gold Hill had been settled during the rush of '49, the original ramshackle tents giving way to proper buildings as fortune smiled on some and abandoned others. Now, 20 years later, it had the settled appearance of a town determined to last beyond the minds that had birthed it. The gathering at the town hall would include every family of standing and plenty who aspired to such status. For the daughter of a failed miner to be marrying into the Porter family owners of the largest mercantile between Sacramento and the high country was precisely the sort of event that would draw attendance shoulders back, Daniel murmured as they approached the brightly lit building. Through the windows, Ruby could see the hall transformed with spring flower arrangements and ribbon streamers. Remember, you've nothing to be ashamed of. I know, Pa. Ruby adjusted her shawl one last time. I just wish... She trailed off, unwilling to voice the longing that occasionally ambushed her, for a match born of affection rather than convenience. Such foolishness had no place in the practical future she'd arranged. The double doors stood open, warm lamplight spilling onto the steps. Ruby took a steadying breath and entered on her father's arm, forcing her lips into a pleasant smile. Conversations paused as they crossed the threshold, heads turning to assess the bride-to-be. Ruby felt the weight of scrutiny but kept her chin lifted, eyes seeking Edwin among the crowd. He stood near the refreshment table, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his narrow build. At 28, Edwin Porter carried himself with the assurance of a man who had never questioned his place in society. His light brown hair was neatly combed, his thin mustache precisely trimmed. The wire-rimmed spectacles he wore lent him an air of scholarly dignity that served him well in business dealings. Beside him, her spine rigid as a ramrod, stood his mother. Sarah Porter's severe gray dress matched her tightly coiled hair, her thin mouth drawn into its habitual line of disapproval. She spotted Ruby immediately, eyes narrowing as they assessed every detail of her appearance. The crowd parted before Ruby and Daniel, whispers following in their wake. Ruby caught fragments. Extraordinarily fortunate match for a girl in her situation, and Edwin could have done better with connections in Sacramento. But she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. She would prove her worth to these people, demonstrate that Edwin had chosen wisely, despite her lack of social standing. Edwin stepped forward as they approached, offering a stiff nod to Daniel before turning to Ruby. His greeting lacked warmth, but she hadn't expected poetry from such a practical man. "You're looking well, Miss Collins." His gaze skimmed her figure briefly before returning to her face, a slight flush rising in his pale cheeks. "I trust you're prepared for the announcement?" "Yes, Mr. Porter, it's very kind of you to arrange such a lovely gathering." Ruby gestured to the decorated hall, conscious of maintaining proper formality before the watching crowd. Edwin's response was cut short by his mother's approach. Sarah Porter extended her gloved hand to Ruby with the reluctance of someone touching something distasteful. "Miss Collins." The older woman's voice could have frozen water in July. "I see you've made an effort with your appearance. How commendable." Ruby curtsied slightly, swallowing the retort that rose to her lips. "Mrs. Porter, the hall looks beautiful. You have quite a talent for organization." Sarah's mouth pinched tighter at the compliment, as if suspecting mockery where none existed. "A merchant's wife must excel at social obligations. I wonder if you truly understand what will be expected of you." "Mother," Edwin interjected with a hint of impatience, "perhaps we should offer refreshments to our guests before the announcement, of course." Sarah placed a proprietary hand on her son's arm. "But first, a word in private, if you please, Edwin. A small matter of seating arrangements." Ruby watched as Sarah led Edwin toward a quiet corner of the hall, their heads bent close in conversation. Something in the older woman's posture, a tension in her shoulders, a triumphant tilt to her chin, stirred unease in Ruby's stomach. "I don't like the look of that," Daniel muttered beside her. "That woman's been against this match from the start." "She'll come around once she sees how I can help with the business," Ruby answered with more confidence than she felt. "Edwin makes his own decisions." As if proving her wrong, Edwin's expression transformed during his mother's intense whispering. The polite mask he'd worn shifted to something harder, his jawline tightening as his gaze flicked toward Ruby with an emotion she couldn't identify. Resolve mixed with something like regret. When he returned to Ruby's side, the subtle change in his demeanor was apparent only to someone watching closely. He stood straighter, chin lifted in a manner reminiscent of his mother. The warm lamplight caught his spectacles, making it impossible to read his eyes. "If I could have everyone's attention," he called, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed room. "I appreciate you all joining us this evening for what was to be a celebration." Ruby's heart stumbled at the word "was." Beside her, she felt her father stiffen. Edwin cleared his throat, glancing once at his mother before continuing. "Upon careful reflection, I find myself obligated to rectify a misjudgment before proceeding further." The crowd's collective intake of breath seemed to suck all air from the room. Ruby stood frozen, the true meaning of Edwin's words penetrating slowly, like cold seeping through layers of clothing. "While Miss Collins possesses admirable qualities," Edwin continued, his voice taking on the dispassionate tone he used when discussing business ledgers, "I have been forced to recognize that certain aspects of the proposed arrangement would be unsuitable for the future I envision." A woman's nervous titter from somewhere in the crowd broke the suspended silence. Ruby's cheeks burned as whispers rustled through the gathering. "As the proprietor of Porter's Mercantile, I must consider how all aspects of my establishment are perceived by our discerning clientele." Edward adjusted his spectacles, still avoiding Ruby's direct gaze. "Upon reflection, and with the wise counsel of those concerned for my welfare, I have concluded that Miss Collins's excessive figure and unsuitable appearance would not project the refinement expected of a merchant's wife." The words struck like physical blows. Ruby's lungs constricted, her vision narrowing to Edwin's face. The face of a man calmly destroying her future before the entirety of Gold Hill society. "Miss Collins would perhaps better suit a man with less discerning clientele," he finished, a slight tremor in his voice, the only indication that this speech cost him anything at all. The hall had gone utterly silent. Ruby stood paralyzed, aware of every eye upon her, of the curves beneath her carefully sewn dress, suddenly transformed from features to fatal flaws. The sensation of her father's hand gripping hers through the new lace gloves seemed to come from miles away. She should say something, defend herself, walk out with dignity, but shame and humiliation had stolen her voice, trapping it somewhere beneath the crushing weight in her chest. Sarah Porter's satisfied expression swimming at the edge of her vision was what finally broke Ruby's paralysis. She would not give that woman the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Drawing on reserves of pride she hadn't known she possessed, Ruby raised her chin and met Edwin's gaze directly. "I see," she said, her voice remarkably steady to her own ears. "How fortunate that your discernment has made itself known before more permanent arrangements were made." A murmur rippled through the crowd at her composure. Edwin blinked, clearly having expected tears or pleading rather than quiet dignity. Before he could respond, Daniel Collins stepped forward, his limp pronounced as he positioned himself protectively beside his daughter. My girl's been spared a greater misfortune than public embarrassment, he announced, his minor's voice carrying to every corner of the hall. She nearly married a man without spine or honor. He turned to Ruby, offering his arm. Come, daughter, the air in here has gone foul. Ruby took her father's arm, focusing on the simple action to keep herself from shattering. She heard Edwin protest something about improper accusations and merely a business decision, but the words washed past her like water over stones. With measured steps that belied the trembling in her knees, Ruby walked with her father toward the doors. The crowd parted again, this time with a different kind of whispers, some pitying, some cruelly amused, some uncomfortably embarrassed. Ruby kept her gaze forward, back straight, as if leaving on her own terms rather than being publicly discarded. They had almost reached the doors when Edwin's mother's voice cut through the murmurs. Such a display only confirms the wisdom of my son's decision. Some women simply lack the refinement required for proper society. Daniel halted, turning back with such fury that Ruby feared what he might do. Before she could restrain him, he'd pulled away from her support and lurched toward Edwin and his mother. You snake, he growled, years of accumulated resentment breaking free. You string along an honest girl for months, benefit from her work on your accounts, then discard her on your mother's say-so? What kind of man acts so? Edwin backed away, alarm replacing his composed expression. Mr. Collins, control yourself. This is precisely the sort of unseemly behavior. Unseemly? Daniel laughed bitterly. I'll show you unseemly. He lunged forward, grabbing Edwin's immaculate lapel with a work-roughened hand. The hall erupted in chaos. Women gasped. Men moved to intervene. Ruby cried out, trying to reach her father as he drew back his fist. Before Daniel could land the blow, two men seized his arms, dragging him backward. That's enough. The town marshal pushed through the crowd, hand on the butt of his pistol. Dan Collins, stand down before I have to lock you up. Daniel struggled against the restraining hands, his face flushed with rage and wounded pride. Let a man defend his daughter's honor, Marshal. Not like this. The marshal's voice was firm but not unkind. You're making things worse for Ruby. Think on that. At the mention of her name, Daniel's resistance faltered. His gaze found Ruby, standing mortified amid the whispering crowd, and the fight drained from him. Come along now, the marshal said quietly. I'll see you both home to cool off, avoid further disturbance. Ruby moved woodenly to her father's side as the marshal guided them toward the door. The last thing she saw before leaving was Sarah Porter's triumphant expression as she fussed over Edwin's disheveled appearance, straightening the lapel as if he were a wounded hero rather than a coward who'd just shattered a woman's future on his mother's whim. Outside, the cool night air hit Ruby like a slap, the contrast between the stuffy hall and the open street momentarily disorienting. The fiddle music continued inside, the social apparently resuming despite or perhaps because of the dramatic interlude. The stars overhead seemed to mock her with their permanence, unconcerned with human humiliations. I'll see you folks safely home, Marshal Burke said, his weathered face showing genuine concern beneath his official demeanor. Tongues will be wagging enough without adding a brawl to the evening's events. I'd have done more than muss his fancy suit if you hadn't interfered, Daniel muttered, but the steam had gone out of him. He looked suddenly older, the weight of his damaged leg more pronounced as Ruby took his arm. And I'd have had to arrest you, the marshal replied evenly. Sarah Porter would press charges faster than a rattler strikes, and where would that leave your daughter? Ruby found her voice at last, though it emerged as a whisper. Please, Pa, let's just go home. Daniel subsided, allowing Ruby to guide him down the street with the marshal following at a respectful distance. The spring night that had seemed so full of promise just hours earlier now felt hollow, the breeze carrying the scent of flowers that had been meant to celebrate her engagement. They had gone only a block when the sound of hurried footsteps made Ruby tense. She turned to see Margaret Wilson, the milliner, hurrying toward them with a shawl clutched around her plump shoulders. Ruby, Daniel, wait! The widow reached them, slightly out of breath. I saw what happened. That Porter boy should be horsewhipped speaking to you so. Ruby mustered a ghost of a smile for the woman who had shown them countless kindnesses since her father's accident. It's kind of you to come, Mrs. Wilson. Kind nothing. I've half a mind to cancel my family's accounts at Porter's. Let's see how he likes losing business over his discernment. The older woman's indignation warmed Ruby slightly. a reminder that not everyone in Gold Hill shared the porter's view of her worth. "You'll do no such thing," Ruby answered. "Your nieces rely on those fancy dress goods Edwin imports specially." "As if I care about ribbons when—" Margaret caught herself, noting Ruby's pallor in the moonlight. "Never mind that now. Come along to my place. I've just made fresh bread and I suspect you could use something stronger than tea to steady your nerves." Ruby hesitated, longing for the privacy of her small room to nurse her wounds away from watchful eyes. But the thought of climbing those stairs, of sitting alone with her humiliation while the social continued without her, was suddenly unbearable. "That's sensible," Marshall Burke approved. "I'll be on my way then, if you're settled." Daniel nodded stiffly, his pride still smarting, but his concern for Ruby outweighing his anger. "Much obliged, Marshall." As Burke tipped his hat and departed, Margaret took Ruby's free arm, creating a small procession of wounded dignity as they made their way to the millinery shop. Inside, the familiar scents of fabric, straw, and the jasmine tea Margaret favored wrapped around Ruby like a comforting blanket. "The kettle's still warm," Margaret announced, bustling about her small kitchen with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing alone. "And I believe this calls for a splash of my late husband's medicinal whiskey." "You're an angel, Maggie," Daniel said, easing himself into a chair with a grimace that spoke of both physical and emotional pain. Ruby stood uncertainly in the doorway, feeling strangely disconnected from her body, as if the woman who had walked proudly into the town hall and the one standing here now were entirely different people. Perhaps they were. "Sit before you fall, child," Margaret urged, pressing a steaming cup into her hands. The sharp scent of whiskey cut through Ruby's daze, bringing her back to the immediate reality. She had been publicly rejected, humiliated, and dismissed as physically unsuitable to be Edwin Porter's wife. A bubble of hysterical laughter rose in her throat, emerging as a sound somewhere between a hiccup and a sob. "It was my figure," she said, the absurdity of it suddenly striking her. "After months of courting, after I balanced his books and organized his inventory and designed a new display for his window, he rejects me because I'm too curvaceous for a merchant's wife?" "It's that witch of a mother," Daniel growled, taking a healthy swallow of his doctored tea. "She's been looking for a way to end this match since it began. Wanted some banker's skinny daughter from Sacramento for her precious boy." Margaret snorted inelegantly. "Sarah Porter wouldn't be satisfied if the Queen of England offered a daughter. That woman measures her worth by the number of people she can look down on." She patted Ruby's hand. "Besides, any man worth his salt appreciates a woman with a figure that won't break in a strong wind." Despite everything, Ruby felt her lips twitch in the beginnings of a smile. "Mrs. Wilson. It's true, my Henry always said, a man wants something to hold on to when the nights get cold." Margaret's plain-spoken comfort was oddly more soothing than polite platitudes would have been. "Edwin Porter wouldn't know what to do with a real woman if one fell into his lap." Daniel choked on his tea, coughing and laughing simultaneously. "Maggie, you'll scandalize my daughter right out of her disappointment." "Good. Better scandalized than heartbroken over that walking ledger book." Margaret refilled their cups, her shrewd eyes assessing Ruby's expression. "You weren't in love with him anyway, were you, dear?" Ruby stared into her tea, considering the question honestly. The pain she felt was real and sharp, but it wasn't the agony of lost love. It was the sting of public rejection, the practical devastation of a secure future vanishing, and, beneath it all, a deep humiliation at being found physically wanting. "No," she admitted softly. "I wasn't in love with him. But I did think we had an understanding, a mutual respect. I thought—" She hesitated, putting words to the belief that had sustained her through months of Edwin's tepid courtship. "I thought he saw my value beyond my appearance or social standing, that he recognized what I could contribute." "And so he did," Margaret said firmly. "That's precisely why his mother intervened. Sarah Porter saw you taking on more responsibilities at the store, saw how customers responded to you, how the accounts improved under your management. She feared you'd become indispensable to the business and to her son." Daniel nodded slowly. "Makes sense. Can't have the hired help becoming too essential, especially when she's the wrong shape for society teas." Ruby's mind returned to the countless hours she'd spent reorganizing Edwin's chaotic bookkeeping, the careful suggestions she'd made about inventory that had increased his profits, the way she'd solved problems that had confounded him. All that work, freely given as an investment in their future partnership, discarded because her waist wasn't narrow enough to satisfy his mother's standards. Something hardened in Ruby's chest, a crystallization of hurt into resolve. She set down her cup with deliberate control. "Well, then," Margaret raised an eyebrow at her tone. "Well, then what?" "Well, then," Ruby repeated, a strange calm settling over her. "I'll simply have to make my own way, won't I?" Daniel studied his daughter's face, recognizing the determined set of her jaw, his late wife's expression before tackling some insurmountable challenge. "Ruby girl, don't do anything rash. Tomorrow's soon enough to think on the future. The future won't wait for my wounded feelings to heal, Pa." Ruby squared her shoulders, the practical side of her nature asserting itself through the fog of humiliation. "We have 2 weeks' rent paid here, and after that we'll need a plan." Margaret hesitated, then spoke carefully. "You know you're welcome to stay on. I could use help with the shop, and—" "That's incredibly kind," Ruby interrupted gently, "but we both know your business can barely support you, let alone 2 more mouths." She reached across the table to squeeze the older woman's hand. "Besides, after tonight, every woman in Gold Hill will think twice about being seen purchasing a hat from someone associated with me." "Nonsense," Margaret protested, but her eyes revealed she understood the cruel realities of small-town society. "What will you do?" Daniel asked quietly, the question that had hung between them since the moment Edwin spoke those devastating words. Ruby stared out the small kitchen window at the distant silhouette of the hills, dark shapes against a star-flecked sky. Those hills had drawn thousands seeking fortune, her father among them. Some found gold, most found only back-breaking labor and disappointment, but occasionally someone discovered opportunity where others saw only obstacles. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'll find something. We're not beaten, Pa." Later, in the solitude of her small room, Ruby finally allowed the tears to come. She wept not for Edwin Porter, nor even for the secure future she'd planned, but for the cruel reminder of how the world valued a woman. Measurements first, capabilities second, if at all. When the tears subsided, leaving her eyes swollen but her mind clearer, Ruby rose and methodically removed the blue calico dress. The garment that had represented hope hours earlier now seemed like a painful relic of naivety. With precise, deliberate movements, she took her sewing scissors and began to cut. Snip by snip, she reduced the dress to usable pieces of fabric, sections that could be repurposed into something practical, something that would serve a new purpose, unconnected to Edwin Porter or his mother's cruel assessment. Each cut of the scissors felt like severing a bond to the life she'd thought she would lead. By the time dawn's first light crept through her window, Ruby had a pile of fabric squares and a new understanding of herself. If Gold Hill society valued a woman's shape above her abilities, perhaps it was time to seek her fortune elsewhere. She was, after all, her father's daughter. A prospector's blood ran in her veins, and somewhere beyond the suffocating constraints of this town, she would stake her own claim. Ruby Collins would never again allow herself to be valued by the measurements of her figure rather than the content of her character. The thought burned like a fever in her blood as she finally lay down to rest. Dreams of independence replacing those of security as the new day dawned. The following morning brought no respite from reality. Ruby rose early despite her exhaustion, splashing cold water on her face to reduce the swelling around her eyes. The reflection that stared back at her from the speckled mirror showed a woman altered overnight. Still the same features, the same curves that had been deemed excessive. But behind her eyes burned a new awareness, a hardness that hadn't existed before Edwin's public rejection. "You'll do," she told her reflection grimly, pinning her hair in a simple, practical style. Today would bring no social calls, no sympathy visits she couldn't bear to receive. Today required action. She dressed in her plainest skirt and shirtwaist, items chosen for utility rather than appearance. The thought of facing Gold Hill's stares and whispers made her stomach clench, but necessity drove her forward. They needed income, and immediately. Her father was already awake when she descended the narrow stairs, sitting at Margaret Wilson's kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The lines in his face seemed deeper in the morning light, but he summoned a smile for her. "There's my girl. Margaret's left fresh coffee and biscuits before opening the shop." Ruby poured herself a cup, warming her hands on the thick mug. "I'm going to find work today." Daniel set down his cup with deliberate care. "Ruby, perhaps wait a few days. Let tongues find something else to wag about." "We can't afford a few days." Ruby's voice was matter-of-fact, stripped of emotion. "Edwin won't be offering me a position at the Mercantile now, and our savings won't last the month." Her father's shoulders slumped slightly. Once, he would have protested that it was his responsibility to provide. Now, they both recognized the practical truth. His injury had reversed their roles. "Where will you look? The dressmaker already has 2 girls and the hotel. I'll try every business in Gold Hill if necessary." Ruby squared her shoulders. The same determination that had sustained her through her mother's death and her father's accident rising to meet this new challenge. Something will present itself. The reality proved harsher than her resolve. By midday, Ruby had visited every respectable establishment in town, offering her services as shopgirl, assistant, or even cleaning woman. At each stop, she was met with uncomfortable glances and polite refusals. Word of last night's humiliation had spread faster than wildfire in August, and no one wanted to risk the porter's displeasure by hiring the woman Edwin had deemed unsuitable. The rebuffs were delivered with varying degrees of kindness or discomfort, but the message remained consistent. There was no place for her in Gold Hill's businesses. By the time Ruby pushed open the door of Jennings' General Store, her final hope, the knot in her stomach had tightened to a painful coil. Herbert Jennings, a balding man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger with obvious discomfort as the bell announced her entrance. "Miss Collins, what can I do for you today?" Ruby straightened her spine, summoning dignity despite the accumulated weight of rejection. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jennings. I was wondering if you might have need of assistance in your store. I'm experienced with bookkeeping and inventory management." Jennings fidgeted with his pencil, unable to meet her eyes directly. "I'm afraid not, Miss Collins. Business is slow this season. Can't justify additional help." The lie was transparent. Ruby could see at least a dozen customers browsing the crowded shelves, and a stack of disorganized invoices teetered precariously on the counter. Still, she nodded politely. "I understand. Thank you for your time." As she turned to leave, the bell jangled again, admitting a weather-beaten man in dusty clothes who nodded briefly at Ruby before addressing Jennings. "Got that order for Silver Creek ready, Herb? Prescott's breathing down my neck about those supplies." "Almost finished, Hank. Just checking the manifest." Jennings seemed relieved by the interruption, gesturing to a pile of crates behind the counter. Ruby paused, her hand on the door. "Silver Creek, the mining camp?" The newcomer, Hank, gave her an appraising look, taking in her respectable but simple appearance. "That's right, miss. I drive the supply wagon out there twice a month. You know someone there?" "No, Ruby hesitated, an idea forming suddenly in her mind. "I couldn't help overhearing. Is Silver Creek a large operation?" Hank scratched his grizzled chin. "About 30 men working the dig now. Western Mining Company took it over last year, still finding decent color. Why do you ask?" Before Ruby could respond, Jennings interjected with obvious discomfort. "Hank, Miss Collins isn't interested in mining affairs. She was just leaving." Something in his dismissive tone sparked Ruby's determination. She turned fully toward Hank, ignoring Jennings entirely. "Actually, I was wondering about employment opportunities." Hank's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hat brim. "At a mining camp? No place for a lady, miss. Rough men, rough language, rougher living." "Not as a miner," Ruby clarified, the idea taking firmer shape as she spoke. "I heard the general store gossip that Silver Creek lost their cook. Is that position still open?" Jennings made a choked sound of surprise, but Hank merely studied her with increased interest. "News travels fast. Old Joe did pack up last week, claimed his rheumatism couldn't take another season in the mountains." He narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. "You can cook, miss?" "My mother taught me well before she passed," Ruby answered. a confidence in her voice that surprised even her. "I can prepare hearty, filling meals for working men, maintain supplies, and keep a kitchen in order." Hank tugged at his beard, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Camp ain't no place for a lady," he repeated, but with less conviction. "Men been makin' do with hardtack and beans since Joe left. Last stew I tasted, there might have been leather boot in it. I assure you, Mr. Simmons." "Mr. Simmons, I can provide significantly better fare than boot leather," Ruby said, with the first genuine smile she'd managed since the previous evening. "And as for it being no place for a lady, perhaps that's fortunate, as I'm merely looking to be a cook." Jennings sputtered from behind his counter. "Miss Collins, you can't seriously be considering such an inappropriate position. A respectable woman alone at a mining camp? The very idea is scandalous." Ruby turned slowly to face the shopkeeper, a new steel in her spine. "More scandalous than starving, Mr. Jennings? More inappropriate than watching my father go without medicine for his leg because no one in this respectable town will offer honest work to a woman whose only sin is having been publicly humiliated?" The directness of her words rendered Jennings momentarily speechless. Into the silence, Hank gave a low chuckle. "You got fire, miss. Might need that up at Silver Creek." He considered her a moment longer, then nodded decisively. "Tell you what, I'll speak to Walter Prescott. He manages the camp. Can't promise nothing, but if you're serious, be ready when I leave tomorrow noon. Bring only what you can carry in one trunk. Camp provides basic supplies, but anything fancy is on your own account." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest, the first ember in the ashes of her former plans. "I'll be ready, Mr. Simmons. Thank you for the opportunity." "Don't thank me yet," Hank warned, though a hint of respect had entered his weathered features. 30 miners ain't known for their manners or patience. First sign of weakness, they'll run you off faster than a coyote from a henhouse. "I'm stronger than I look," Ruby assured him, thinking of all she'd already endured. After Edwin Porter's public rejection, how much worse could a camp of rough miners possibly be? As Ruby stepped back onto Gold Hill's main street, the weight of stares and whispers seemed somehow diminished. Let them talk. By tomorrow, she would be beyond their reach, forging a new path far from the constraints and judgments that had defined her world until now. The thought should have terrified her. A young woman setting off for a remote mining camp, surrounded by strangers, doing work no respectable woman would consider. Instead, beneath the natural trepidation, Ruby felt something unexpected stirring. The first tendrils of freedom taking root, where security had withered. "You've lost your senses entirely," Daniel Collins paced their small room later that afternoon, his damaged leg dragging more pronouncedly with his agitation. "A mining camp? Alone among 30 men? I can't allow it, Ruby. I won't." Ruby continued folding her modest belongings into the battered trunk that had once contained her mother's trousseau. "There's nothing improper about cooking, Pa. It's honest work for fair wages." "Nothing improper." Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. "Have you any idea what kind of men work those remote claims? Rough sorts with rougher appetites. No filters on their language or behavior." "I grew up around miners," Ruby reminded him calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she packed her mother's old recipe book. "You weren't exactly reciting poetry when you came home from the diggings." Daniel raked a hand through his graying hair. "That was different. You had your mother's protection, a proper home." His voice softened with concern. "Ruby girl, there are other options. Margaret would let us stay on credit until something else presents itself." Ruby paused in her packing, turning to face her father directly. "What options, Pa? Every door in Gold Hill closed today. Not because I can't do the work, but because Edwin Porter publicly declared me physically unsuitable as his wife." The bitterness she'd suppressed all day edged into her voice, as if a woman's worth is measured by the circumference of her waist rather than the content of her character. "Then we'll leave Gold Hill," Daniel countered desperately. "Sacramento has opportunities. With your skills." "With what money?" Ruby's practicality cut through his protests. "The fare to Sacramento alone would take our remaining savings, with nothing for lodging or food while searching for work." She crossed to her father, taking his work-roughened hands in hers. Silver Creek offers immediate employment, housing, and meals. I'll earn enough to send money home to build up savings." Daniel squeezed her hands, his eyes reflecting the pain of a father unable to protect his child. "And what of your reputation? No decent man will court a woman who's lived at a mining camp." A hollow laugh escaped Ruby before she could contain it. "My reputation? After last night, what reputation remains to protect?" She softened her tone at the hurt in his eyes. "Besides, I've had my fill of decent men for the moment. Edwin Porter was the most decent man in Gold Hill, wasn't he? And look how that ended." Margaret Wilson appeared in the doorway, a plate of sandwiches in her hands. She'd been uncharacteristically quiet since Ruby announced her decision, but now she spoke with firm conviction. "Daniel Collins, stop adding to the girl's burden. Ruby's made the only sensible choice available, and your fussing won't change circumstances." She set down the plate and fixed him with a stern look. "Would you rather she stay here, withering under the weight of gossip and pity, watching you sacrifice what little you have left for her comfort?" Daniel deflated slightly, the truth of Margaret's words impossible to deny. "I only want to protect her." "You raised her strong," Margaret countered. "Now trust in that strength." She turned to Ruby, her practical nature asserting itself. "I've wrapped up some basic medical supplies, liniment for aches, willow bark for fevers and such. Mining camps are short on comforts." Ruby embraced the older woman, gratitude welling in her throat. "Thank you for understanding." "I understand necessity when I see it," Margaret replied briskly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "Now, I've another something for you." She produced a small leather pouch from her pocket. "It's not much, just the profit from last month's bonnets, but it might provide a cushion until your first wages." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and will," Margaret insisted, pressing the pouch into Ruby's hand. "Consider it an investment. When you've made your fortune, you can order the finest hat in my shop." The jest broke the tension, drawing reluctant smiles from both Ruby and her father. As Margaret tactfully withdrew to give them privacy, Daniel sighed heavily and lowered himself to sit on the edge of Ruby's bed. "I don't like this, Ruby girl. Not one bit." He stared at his damaged leg, the physical manifestation of his inability to provide as he once had. "But I can't offer a better alternative, and that cuts deeper than any mine collapse." Ruby knelt before him, her heart aching at the defeat in his posture. "This isn't forever, Pa, just until we find our feet again." She managed a smile, injecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Think of it as prospecting, just like you taught me. Sometimes you have to dig through a lot of dirt before finding gold." Daniel's weathered face creased in a reluctant smile. "You always did have my optimism." He cupped her cheek with a calloused hand. "And your mother's backbone. She'd be proud of your courage, even while worrying herself sick about this scheme." "Then you'll give your blessing?" Ruby asked softly. "Not my blessing," Daniel corrected, "but my respect for your decision, and a promise that I'll be waiting when you decide to come home." His blue eyes, so like her own, held a fierce protectiveness. "First sign of trouble, you send word. I may have a bum leg, but I can still handle a shotgun if any of those miners forget themselves around my daughter." Ruby laughed despite the lump in her throat. "I'll be fine, Pa. I'm going to cook, not dance the can-can." As darkness fell over Gold Hill, Ruby made final preparations for her departure. The practical arrangements occupied her hands, but her mind replayed Edwin's cruel words in the town hall, using the humiliation to fuel her resolve. Perhaps someday she would thank him for setting her free from the cage of limited expectations. For now, the pain remained too fresh for gratitude. Ruby Collins might have been deemed unsuitable as a merchant's wife, but tomorrow would reveal what she might yet become on her own terms. The unknown path before her contained equal measures of terror and possibility, a landscape not unlike the Gold Country itself, with its hidden treasures and sudden precipices. As she finally lay down to sleep on her last night in Gold Hill, Ruby found herself imagining the remote mining camp that would become her home. Rough men, rough conditions, rough language, Mr. Simmons had warned her repeatedly. Yet somehow none of it seemed as daunting as the prospect of remaining here, diminished by rejection and constrained by the narrow definitions of womanhood that had found her wanting. Better the honest roughness of Silver Creek than the polished cruelty of Gold Hill society. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something entirely new. Whether triumph or disaster remained to be seen, but it would be a path of her own choosing. With that thought fixed firmly in her mind, Ruby drifted into a dreamless sleep, the first peaceful rest she'd found since the moment Edwin Porter and his mother had broken her carefully constructed future into pieces that could never be reassembled. What might be built from those fragments remained to be discovered, beyond the boundaries of all she had known before. Edwin cleared his throat with a precise, practiced sound that instantly hushed the assembled crowd. Ruby felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach as she stood beside her father, waiting for the words that would secure her future. The town hall's decorations, spring flowers gathered from the surrounding hills, seemed to blur slightly at the edges of her vision as she focused on Edwin's face. "Ladies and gentlemen of Gold Hill," Edwin began, his voice carrying the measured cadence he used when announcing special shipments at his store. "I appreciate your attendance at this gathering, which was intended as a celebration." A prickle of unease crept along Ruby's spine at his use of "was intended." Beside her, she felt her father stiffen slightly. "However," Edwin continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "I find myself obligated to rectify a misjudgment before proceeding further with plans that would affect the future of Porter's Mercantile." Ruby's breath caught in her chest. She glanced towards Sarah Porter, whose thin mouth had curved into a smile that contained neither warmth nor kindness. The older woman nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging her son to continue. "While Miss Collins possesses certain admirable qualities," Edwin said, his gaze now fixed somewhere above Ruby's head as if he couldn't bear to look directly at her, "I have been forced to recognize that our proposed arrangement would be unsuitable for the establishment I represent." A confused murmur rippled through the gathering. Ruby stood paralyzed, the blood draining from her face as understanding dawned with horrible clarity. "As the proprietor of Gold Hill's premier mercantile," Edwin continued, his voice growing stronger with his mother's approving nods, "I must consider how all aspects of my business appear to our discerning clientele. Upon reflection, and with the wise counsel of those who have my best interests at heart," here he glanced briefly at his mother, "I have concluded that Miss Collins's excessive figure and unsuitable appearance would not project the refinement expected of a merchant's wife." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Ruby felt as though she'd been struck physically, her lungs emptying in a silent rush. The soft curves of her body, always a source of private insecurity amid Gold Hill's fashionable silhouettes, suddenly became a public failing, announced to the entire community. Edwin's voice turned cold as Winter Creek water. A merchant's wife must present an image of tasteful refinement. Miss Collins would perhaps better suit a man with less discerning clientele. The final words hung in the air like a gunshot. Ruby stood frozen, humiliation burning her cheeks until they felt ablaze. The room had gone deathly silent, every eye upon her as Edwin's cruel assessment stripped away not just their engagement, but her dignity. When she finally found the strength to lift her gaze from the floor, she saw not Edwin, but the faces of Gold Hill society, some shocked, some embarrassed, some poorly concealing their satisfaction at another's misfortune. In that moment, Ruby understood with perfect clarity that she had always been viewed as an outsider, reaching above her station. To them, this public rejection was merely the natural order reasserting itself. Summoning reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed, Ruby lifted her chin. "I see," she said, her voice miraculously steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "How fortunate we both are to discover your discernment before more permanent arrangements were made." A ripple of surprised whispers followed her composure. Edwin blinked, clearly having expected tears or pleading rather than dignity. Before Edwin could respond, Daniel Collins stepped forward, his limp pronounced as fury propelled him toward the merchant. "You spineless weasel," he growled. Years of miner's work evident in the strength of his weathered hands as they reached for Edwin's immaculate lapels. "You string my girl along for months, use her skills for your business, then discard her on your mother's say-so?" Two men moved quickly to restrain Daniel as his fingers brushed Edwin's coat. Ruby cried out, "Pa, don't!" but her father's rage had momentum of its own. "Let go of me!" Daniel struggled against the restraining hands. "This coward needs a lesson in how a man behaves." Edwin backed away, alarm replacing his composed expression. "Mr. Collins, control yourself. This unseemly display only confirms the wisdom of my decision." Those words ignited Daniel's fury further. With a strength that belied his damaged leg, he lunged forward, breaking free momentarily before additional men stepped in to hold him back. "That's enough!" Marshal Burke pushed through the crowd, hand resting meaningfully on his pistol. "Dan Collins, stand down before I have to lock you up." "Lock me up, then!" Daniel shouted, still struggling. "Worth a night in jail to teach this yellow-bellied shop boy what happens when you humiliate a good woman." "Not like this," the marshal said firmly, gripping Daniel's arm. "You're making things worse for Ruby. Think on that." At the mention of his daughter's name, Daniel's resistance faltered. His gaze found Ruby, standing mortified amid the whispering crowd, and the fight drained visibly from him. "Come along now," Marshal Burke said, his voice gentler. "I'll see you both home to cool off." He guided them toward the door, the crowd parting like water around a stone. The last thing Ruby saw before leaving was Sarah Porter's triumphant expression as she fussed over Edwin, straightening his collar as though he'd survived some great ordeal rather than delivered a calculated insult. Outside, the cool night air struck Ruby's flushed face. The contrast between the stuffy hall and the open street made her dizzy, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She stumbled to the nearest hitching post, gripping the rough wood as her composure finally cracked. "Ruby girl," her father said helplessly, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks as he watched his daughter's shoulders shake with silent sobs. Marshal Burke stood awkwardly nearby, hat in his hands. "I'm sorry, Ruby. That was a cruel thing to witness." Before Ruby could respond, a gentle hand touched her arm. Margaret Wilson, the widow who owned the millinery shop where Ruby and her father rented a room, stood beside her, kind eyes filled with practical concern. "Come along, dear," she said firmly. "This street's no place for your tears. Let them gossip without an audience." With Margaret's support on one side and her father's on the other, Ruby made her way down Gold Hill's main street, each step an effort of will. Behind them, fiddle music resumed in the town hall, the celebration continuing without its intended guests of honor. Later that night, in the privacy of her small room, Ruby stared at the blue calico dress she'd sewn with such hope. Every stitch represented hours of dreaming about a secure future, a respectable position, a life beyond the precarious existence she and her father had endured since his accident. With sudden decision, Ruby reached for her sewing scissors. The sharp blades caught the lamplight as she made the first cut through the fabric. Snip by snip, she reduced the dress to pieces, her tears gradually giving way to a smoldering anger that warmed her from within. By the time dawn's first light crept through her window, the dress lay in neat squares that could be repurposed for something practical, something unconnected to Edwin Porter or his mother's cruel assessment. Ruby ran her fingers over the fabric, a vow forming in her heart. Never again would she allow her worth to be determined by a man's approval. Never again would she mistake security for happiness. The path ahead remained uncertain, but of one thing Ruby was absolutely sure. Whatever future she built would be of her own making, beyond the narrow confines of what Gold Hill deemed suitable for a woman with an excessive figure and limited prospects. Ruby Collins awoke to sunlight streaming through her small window, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous evening crashed back into her consciousness. The scratchy sensation around her eyes from dried tears and the pile of cut calico squares on her table confirmed that the humiliation had not been merely a nightmare. The clock on her bedside table showed 7:30, late by her standards, though her body ached as if she hadn't slept at all. She washed her face in the basin, the cold water shocking some semblance of clarity into her mind. The mirror revealed puffy eyes and pallor where her usual healthy glow had been. Ruby pinched her cheeks roughly, determined not to look as broken as she felt. "No time for self-pity," she muttered, dressing in her plain work skirt and shirtwaist, "not with the rent due in 2 weeks." Downstairs, she found her father already at Margaret Wilson's kitchen table, his gnarled fingers wrapped around a steaming coffee cup. The lines around his eyes had deepened overnight. guilt etching new patterns into his weathered face. "Ruby girl," he said, attempting cheerfulness. "Margaret left fresh bread before opening the shop. Said you should keep your strength up." Ruby managed a thin smile as she poured herself coffee. That was kind of her. She hesitated, gathering her courage. "Pa, we need to talk about what happens now." Daniel Collins stared into his cup. "I've been thinking on that. Maybe I could try the Smith place again. Last time Fred mentioned needing help with—" "Pa, stop." Ruby covered his hand with hers. "Your leg won't stand a full day's labor. We both know that." The admission hung heavy between them. Her father's mining accident had left him with a permanent limp and pain that grew worse with physical exertion. The proud man who had once outworked men half his age could now barely manage an afternoon of light tasks without being bedridden the next day. "I'm going to find work," Ruby announced, her voice firmer than she felt. "Edwin wasn't just my fiancé, he was my employer. Without that position at the store, we need another source of income." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly. Once, he would have protested that providing was his responsibility. Now, they both recognized the painful reversal of their roles. "Where will you look?" "The dressmaker has her nieces helping in the hotel." "I'll try every business in Gold Hill if necessary." Ruby straightened her spine, the same determination that had sustained her through her mother's death and her father's accident, rising to meet this new challenge. Something will present itself. The morning slipped into afternoon as Ruby's confidence eroded with each closed door. The hotel manager couldn't meet her eyes as he claimed they needed no additional help, despite visibly overworked maids rushing past. The dressmaker offered weak excuses about business being slow, while her sewing room bustled with activity. Even the laundry, where Chinese workers handled the town's washing in steaming vats, turned her away. By 3 o'clock, Ruby had visited every respectable establishment in Gold Hill. At each stop, she encountered uncomfortable glances and unconvincing refusals. Only once did she receive an honest answer, when Mrs. Phelps at the bakery whispered, "Sarah Porter's been by this morning. Made it clear that anyone hiring you would lose the mercantile's business. I'm sorry, Ruby." The information settled like a stone in Ruby's stomach. Edwin's mother had moved quickly to ensure her humiliation was complete, not just rejected as a bride, but blacklisted from honest employment. By sunset, with her feet aching and pride in tatters, Ruby stepped into Jennings' general store, her final hope. Herbert Jennings looked up from his ledger with obvious discomfort as the bell announced her entrance. "Ms. Collins, what can I do for you today?" Ruby squared her shoulders, summoning dignity despite the day's accumulated rejections. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jennings. I wondered if you might need assistance in your store. I'm experienced with bookkeeping and inventory." Jennings fidgeted with his pencil, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm afraid not, Miss Collins. Business is slow this season. Can't justify additional help." The lie was transparent. Ruby could see at least a dozen customers browsing the crowded shelves, and a stack of disorganized invoices teetered precariously on the counter. Still, she nodded politely. "I understand. Thank you for your time." As she turned to leave, the bell jangled again, admitting a weather-beaten man in dusty clothes who nodded briefly at Ruby before addressing Jennings. "Got that order for Silver Creek ready, Herb? Prescott's breathing down my neck about those supplies." "Almost finished, Hank. Just checking the manifest." Jennings seemed relieved by the interruption, gesturing to a pile of crates behind the counter. Ruby paused, her hand on the door. "Silver Creek? The mining camp?" the newcomer gave. Hank gave her an appraising look, taking in her respectable but simple appearance. "That's right, miss. I drive the supply wagon out there twice a month." "I couldn't help overhearing," Ruby said, an idea forming suddenly. "Is it true they need a cook? I heard their previous one left." Hank's bushy eyebrows shot upward. "Old Joe headed to Nevada last week, claimed his rheumatism couldn't take another season in the mountains." His eyes narrowed. Why would a proper young lady ask about such things? Ruby's mind raced. A mining camp. 30 miles from Gold Hill, populated entirely by rough men with rougher language? No respectable woman would consider such employment. Yet as the sunlight slanted through Jennings' dusty windows, marking another day's end with no prospects, desperation pushed aside propriety. "I'm inquiring about employment, Mr. Simmons. Hank Simmons." He tugged at his beard, clearly wrestling with the impropriety of their conversation. Camp ain't no place for a lady, miss. 30 miners with mud on their boots and worse on their tongues. No other women for miles. Ruby straightened her spine. I can cook, Mr. Simmons. My mother taught me well before she passed. Hearty meals, fresh bread, proper management of provisions. Jennings interrupted with obvious discomfort. Miss Collins, this is hardly appropriate conversation. Silver Creek is no place for someone of your background. The dismissal in his tone, so similar to Edwin's the night before, kindled Ruby's determination. She turned fully toward Hank, ignoring Jennings entirely. What wages does the position offer? Hank named a figure that made Ruby's eyes widen slightly. Nearly twice what she'd earned at Porter's Mercantile. Seeing her reaction, he added gruffly, high pay because no one wants the job. Isolated, rough conditions, hard work from before sunrise till after sunset. When do you return to camp? Ruby asked, decision crystallizing with each passing moment. Tomorrow noon. Hank studied her with increasing curiosity. You're serious about this? Completely serious. Ruby met his gaze steadily. Would you speak to the camp manager on my behalf? Hank scratched his stubbled chin. Walter Prescott ain't easily convinced, especially about bringing a woman to camp. All I ask is the opportunity to make my case. Ruby's voice held more confidence than she felt. I need work, Mr. Simmons. Honest work for fair wages. Something in her direct gaze must have impressed the wagon driver. He nodded slowly. I'll speak to Prescott. Be at the western edge of town tomorrow at noon if you're still of this mind. Bring only what fits in one trunk. Camp supplies the basics. I'll be there, Ruby promised, ignoring Jennings' shocked expression. Ruby's steps were lighter as she walked home, though apprehension curled through her stomach like smoke. The idea was madness. A young, unmarried woman at a remote mining camp, surrounded by men who'd likely not seen a female face in months. Yet the alternative was watching her father suffer as their meager savings dwindled to nothing. Daniel's reaction was exactly as she'd anticipated. You've lost your senses entirely, he shouted, pacing their small room. A mining camp? Alone among 30 men? I won't allow it. There's nothing improper about cooking, Ruby countered, already pulling out the trunk that had once contained her mother's trousseau. It's honest work for fair wages. Nothing improper, Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. Have you any idea what kind of men work those remote claims? Their argument lasted until Margaret intervened with practical wisdom. Daniel Collins, would you rather she stay here, withering under gossip and pride, watching you sacrifice what little you have left? By morning, Daniel had reluctantly accepted the inevitable. As Ruby closed her trunk, he pressed something into her hand. A small knife in a leather sheath. Keep it close, he said gruffly, and remember who you are. At noon, Ruby stood beside Hank's wagon at the edge of town, her trunk loaded, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be visible through her bodice. As the horses lurched forward, she glanced back at Gold Hill, the only home she'd ever known, now transformed into a place of rejection and closed doors. Terror and strange relief mingled in her chest as buildings gave way to scattered pines and the dusty road wound upward into the foothills. Ruby Collins, once destined to be a merchant's respectable wife, was now headed to a place where no proper woman would venture, toward a future as uncertain as the shifting shadows on the distant mountains. Yet beneath her fear flickered something unexpected, a tiny flame of freedom, burning brighter with each mile that separated her from the constraints and judgments that had found her wanting. Chapter 2, Silver Creek, May 1870. Ruby's teeth clacked together as the wagon hit another rut, bouncing her so hard her bonnet slipped askew. After 4 hours of this punishment, her backside felt bruised beyond repair, a complaint she'd sooner die than voice to Hank Simmons. The supply wagon's wooden bench offered no cushioning, and the mountain trail to Silver Creek seemed determined to test the limits of both the vehicle's axles and her spine. Might want to hang on, Hank advised, a hint of amusement creasing his weathered face as he guided the team around a particularly treacherous bend. Next stretch is what I call the Devil's Washboard. Ruby tightened her grip on the seat edge, determined to maintain her dignity. I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Simmons. Hank chuckled, the sound as rough as the stubble covering his jaw. "Most folks call me just Hank, Miss Collins. Mr. Simmons makes me look over my shoulder for my Ruby managed a smile despite her discomfort. "Then I'm just Ruby." "Fair enough." Hank nodded, then added with unexpected kindness, "You got grit, Ruby Collins. Gonna need it up here." The wagon crested a rise and Hank pulled the team to a halt. "There she is, Silver Creek." Ruby leaned forward, her discomfort forgotten as she took in her first view of the mining camp spread across the mountainside below. 24 rough-hewn cabins clustered around a central clearing, smoke rising from stone chimneys. A larger structure she presumed was the cookhouse stood near what appeared to be the mine entrance, a dark wound in the hillside with ore carts on rails leading from its mouth. Men moved about like ants, some pushing wheelbarrows, others carrying tools or tending to equipment. The beauty of the setting struck her as forcefully as the primitive conditions. Pine forests surrounded the camp, climbing toward snow-capped peaks that still held winter's grip. A creek, presumably Silver Creek itself, tumbled down the mountainside, its clear water catching the afternoon sunlight. "It's wilder than I imagined," Ruby admitted, suddenly aware of how unprepared she might be for this new life. 30 miles from Gold Hill might as well be 300 out here, Hank replied. "Nature's still in charge for all our digging and building." As they descended toward camp, Hank offered practical advice between the wagon's jolts and shudders. "Cook's quarters are behind the kitchen, small but private. Previous fellas kept it decent enough. Don't venture into the barracks. That's where most men bunk. They work in shifts, so there's always someone sleeping, always someone drinking or gambling. Sunday's quietest, but even then..." He glanced sideways at her. "You sure about this, girl? Not too late to turn back?" Ruby squared her shoulders, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Quite sure, thank you." The last stretch of road leveled somewhat as they approached the camp's perimeter. Ruby caught sight of herself in a puddle's reflection. Bonnet crooked, wisps of hair escaping their pins, dust coating her plain traveling dress. Hurriedly, she made what adjustments she could, aware that first impressions would matter tremendously in this isolation. As the wagon rumbled into camp, men stopped whatever tasks had occupied them. Shovels paused mid-dig, conversations halted mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes, at least 24 by Ruby's quick count, fixed on the unexpected female form perched beside Hank. Ruby clutched her carpet bag tighter against her chest, fighting the urge to shrink beneath their collective gaze. Some men removed hats respectfully, others openly gaped. A few exchanged meaningful glances that made her cheeks burn. She felt stripped naked by their attention, caught between terror and determination. "Brought supplies," Hank called out unnecessarily, breaking the awkward silence. "And a new cook." A low murmur spread through the gathered men. Ruby forced herself to sit straighter, chin lifted in what she hoped appeared as confidence rather than the desperation that had driven her here. Their scrutiny made her uncomfortably aware of the curves that had been deemed excessive in Gold Hill, curves now outlined against her travel-wrinkled dress as the only feminine form these men had likely seen in months. The wagon halted before the largest cabin, which bore a crude sign, "Camp Office." "Best wait here," Hank murmured. "Prescott'll want to approve this arrangement himself." As Hank climbed down from the wagon, Ruby remained seated, uncomfortably aware she'd become an impromptu spectacle. She fixed her gaze on the distant mountains, pretending an immunity to the stares that she was far from feeling. The office door banged open with enough force to make Ruby start. A tall man emerged, his movements suggesting barely leashed energy despite his age, which Ruby guessed to be early 50s. Gray threaded his dark hair and full beard, and deep lines etched a face that had weathered countless mountain seasons. Sharp eyes assessed her from beneath bushy brows as he strode toward the wagon. "What in tarnation is this, Simmons?" the man demanded, voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to having his decisions questioned. "Told you to bring back supplies and a cook, not some city girl playing at adventure." Ruby's spine stiffened at the dismissal. Before Hank could respond, she gathered her skirts and climbed down from the wagon without assistance, refusing to appear helpless before either man. "Walter Prescott, I presume?" She extended her hand in businesslike fashion. I'm Ruby Collins, your new cook, provided we can come to terms. Prescott ignored her outstretched hand, circling her with narrowed eyes like a wolf sizing up unfamiliar prey. Ruby held her ground, meeting his gaze steadily despite the hammering of her heart. You know how to cook? He finally asked, skepticism dripping from each word. For 30 men? 3 meals daily without complaint? My mother ran a boarding house in Gold Hill before she passed, Ruby replied, the lie coming easier than expected. I've fed mining crews all my life. Biscuits, stews, roasts when available, pies that don't break teeth. She tilted her chin upward. I can stretch provisions without sacrificing taste and manage inventory so you're not left short before supply runs. Prescott's expression remained dubious. Cooking's just part of it. Camp life is harsh, Miss Collins. No luxuries, no privacy to speak of. Weather turns mean up here. Snow in May ain't unusual. First sign of feminine hysterics or complaints about conditions, you're out. Ruby bit back a sharp retort about feminine hysterics, recognizing the test in his words. I don't require luxury, Mr. Prescott. Only fair treatment and honest pay for honest work. $30 monthly room and board included, Prescott countered. Same as we paid old Joe. 40, Ruby returned without hesitation. I bring skills Joe likely lacked. I can read and keep accounts, manage supplies efficiently, and I'd wager my biscuits won't be mistaken for mining tools. A ripple of surprised laughter came from several miners who'd edged close enough to overhear. Prescott's mouth twitched in what might have been suppressed amusement. 35, he offered. And you get the private room behind the kitchen. 1-week trial. If the men complain about the food, or you create any disturbance to camp operations, you're on the next supply wagon back to Gold Hill. Ruby extended her hand again, more determined than the first time. Agreed. Plus, I require a lock on my door. Prescott raised an eyebrow, but finally clasped her hand in a brief, firm shake. These men know the rules. Any who forget will answer to me. But the lock's sensible, his assessment continued, less hostile but no less thorough. Can you start today? Men'll want supper in 3 hours. I'll need to see the pantry and kitchen first, Ruby answered, practicality overcoming her exhaustion from the journey. But yes, I can manage something for tonight. Prescott nodded once, apparently satisfied. Hank, show Miss Collins to the cookhouse after you've unloaded. Old Pete can help her get settled. He's too decrepit for mining, but knows his way around camp. Ruby fought to keep relief from showing on her face. One hurdle cleared. She'd secured the position, at least temporarily. Now she merely needed to prove her worth to a camp full of men who clearly viewed her as either an oddity or an unwelcome disruption to their established routines. As Prescott returned to his office, Hank leaned closer to murmur, "Not many folks negotiate with Prescott and walk away with more than they started. Reckon you might survive here after all, Ruby Collins." Ruby managed a smile that felt more confident than she actually was. I've discovered recently, Mr. Simmons, Hank, that survival requires more backbone than I knew I possessed. From the corner of her eye, Ruby noticed the miners still watching her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She drew a deep breath and turned to face them directly, refusing to begin this new chapter of her life by cowering. Whatever Silver Creek held for her, opportunity or disaster, she would meet it standing tall, no matter how her knees trembled beneath her dusty skirts. Ruby stood frozen in the doorway of the Silver Creek cookhouse, momentarily overwhelmed by the chaos before her. The large stone fireplace was caked with grease, blackened pots lay crusted with the remnants of previous meals, and the plank floor was littered with food scraps that crunched beneath her boots. A quick inspection of the pantry revealed disorganized shelves, with flour beetles crawling through open sacks and coffee spilled across wooden surfaces. "Sweet mercy," she whispered, fighting the urge to turn and flee. "Ain't pretty, is it?" The gravelly voice behind her belonged to a wizened old man with a white beard that reached nearly to his belt. He leaned heavily on a cane, rheumy blue eyes twinkling with surprising liveliness in his weathered face. Old Joe weren't much for cleanliness, claimed dirt added flavor. Ruby removed her bonnet and hung it on a peg by the door. "And who might you be?" "They call me Old Pete. Been mining since 49. He extended a gnarled hand. "Prescott said I'm to help you get settled. These days, I'm more use with a spoon than a pickaxe." Ruby shook his hand. noting the enlarged knuckles that spoke of years of hard labor. "Well, Mr. Pete, I hope you're prepared to work. We've got," she glanced at the battered clock on the wall, "less than 3 hours to produce dinner for 30 hungry men." "Can't be done," Pete stated matter-of-factly. "Not in this pigsty. Men'll have to make do with jerky tonight." Ruby's spine stiffened. Failure on her first day would only confirm Prescott's doubts about her capabilities. "We'll manage," she declared, untying her travel cloak. "First, hot water, lots of it." To her surprise, Pete didn't argue. He shuffled to the water pump in the corner and began filling a large kettle. "You're the boss, Missy." Ruby surveyed the room with a strategist's eye, mentally cataloging urgent tasks. She rolled up her sleeves, pinned her hair more securely, and tied one of the grimy aprons hanging by the door around her waist. "Lye soap?" she asked. Pete pointed to a shelf. "What's left of it?" For the next hour, Ruby attacked the filth with methodical determination. She scrubbed pots and work surfaces while simultaneously delegating tasks to Pete, who proved more capable than his frail appearance suggested. When 2 young miners peered in curiously, Ruby immediately pressed them into service, carrying water and stacking firewood. "You there," she called to another passing miner. "Would you be so kind as to bring my trunk from the wagon to my quarters? I need my spices." The burly man looked startled at being addressed directly, but nodded and complied without complaint. By the second hour, the kitchen had undergone a remarkable transformation. Clean pots hung from hooks, work surfaces gleamed, and the fire crackled cheerfully beneath a bubbling pot of stew Ruby had concocted from the limited but salvageable supplies. Salt pork, dried beans, the last of the winter potatoes, and an onion she'd found sprouting in a sack. "It ain't fancy," Pete observed as Ruby formed dough for biscuits, her fingers working with practiced efficiency despite her exhaustion. "It'll be hot, filling, and won't poison anyone," Ruby replied, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek. "Tomorrow will be better once I've properly inventoried what we have." When she opened her small trunk to retrieve her mother's spice box, Pete's eyes widened at the neatly organized collection of seasonings. Old Joe had salt and pepper. Occasionally threw in some coffee grounds if he was feeling adventurous. Ruby smiled for the first time since arriving. My mother believed even the simplest meal deserved respect. She sprinkled dried herbs into the stew, inhaling the improved aroma with satisfaction. By 6 o'clock, the transformation was complete. The long trestle tables had been scrubbed, mismatched tin plates and cups arranged at each place, and the room filled with the appetizing scent of savory stew and fresh biscuits. Ruby had even managed to brew a pot of decent coffee, rescuing the beans from their scattered state and grinding them properly. The dinner bell's clang sent a wave of apprehension through her. She stood behind the serving table, ladle in hand, as miners began filing in. 30 men of varying ages and appearances, united by their rough attire and skeptical expressions as they assessed their new cook. The first brave souls accepted their bowls cautiously, sniffing the contents before seating themselves at the tables. Ruby maintained her composure despite her racing heart, serving each man with the same courteous efficiency. "This what we're paying for?" A burly miner with a red beard thrust his bowl toward Ruby. "Looks like dishwater with bits floating in it." The room quieted, all eyes shifting between Ruby and her challenger. It was a test, Ruby realized, the kind that would define her place in this isolated community. Setting down her ladle deliberately, Ruby fixed the man with a look that would have withered spring vegetables. "That dishwater, sir, contains more nutrition than you've likely had in a month. If you prefer to cook for yourself, I believe there's still some jerky in the supply." She held his gaze steadily. "Or you're welcome to try a spoonful before passing judgment." For a tense moment, the miner's face darkened. Then he snorted, dug his spoon into the stew, and shoved a heaping portion into his mouth. A beat passed as he chewed, the room silent with anticipation. "Well?" Ruby prompted, one eyebrow raised. "It'll do," he grunted reluctantly, returning to his place at the table. A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Men who had hesitated now eagerly accepted their portions, and soon the room filled with the sounds of earnest eating and appreciative murmurs. When Ruby brought out the hot biscuits, a spontaneous cheer erupted. "Take it easy, you savages," Pete called out, chuckling as men reached for the steaming bread. "They ain't the last biscuits in creation." By the meal's end, empty bowls testified to Ruby's success. As the miners filed out, many nodding respectfully or muttering awkward thanks, Walter Prescott appeared in the doorway. He surveyed the transformed kitchen, the cleaned-out pot, and the satisfied expressions of his departing workers. "Reckon she'll do," old Pete announced before Prescott could speak. His roomy eyes twinkling at Ruby. "Girl's got more sand than half your diggers." Prescott's mouth twitched in what might have been approval. "We'll see if she lasts the week." But his tone lacked its earlier skepticism as he turned and left without further comment. Ruby sank onto a bench when the last miner departed, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally ebbing. Her back ached, her feet throbbed, and her hands were red from scrubbing in hot water. Yet beneath the exhaustion thrummed a quiet sense of accomplishment. Her first victory in this strange new world. "You did good, girl," Pete said, settling his creaky frame beside her. "Though tomorrow won't be easier." "I know," Ruby replied, summoning a tired smile. "But tomorrow I'll be ready for them." May stretched into June as Ruby established her routine at Silver Creek. She rose each morning well before dawn, kindling the cookhouse fire while stars still glittered through the small window. By the time the earliest shift staggered in for breakfast, bleary-eyed men headed for the darkness of the mine tunnels, she had hot coffee brewing, flapjacks sizzling on the griddle, and salt pork crackling in its own fat. She learned the miners' preferences with surprising quickness. Bronson, the burly, red-bearded man who had challenged her that first night, wolfed down twice the portion of others but detested onions. Young Murphy couldn't abide his food touching on the plate and flushed crimson whenever Ruby addressed him directly. Old Pete savored each bite with deliberate slowness, his worn teeth struggling with anything tougher than stew. The initial wariness between Ruby and the miners gradually transformed into a comfortable arrangement. She maintained clear boundaries. No entering her private quarters behind the kitchen, no crude language in her presence, proper washing at the pump outside before meals. That the men respected with only occasional lapses. "Hands bleeding, Matthews," she noted one evening, spotting a miner trying to hide his injury. "Finish your supper, then come by for bandaging." Word spread that the cook could dress wounds, and soon men appeared with everything from minor cuts to deeper gashes that tested her stomach's fortitude. Ruby never flinched, drawing on half-remembered instructions from her mother and practical common sense. When she noticed frayed shirt collars and missing buttons, she set up a mending basket in the corner of the cookhouse. "Leave your repairs here," she announced one morning, "with your name pinned to them. I'll tend to what I can during quiet hours." This unexpected service earned her a protective loyalty from the miners that surprised her. When a new worker made a suggestive comment as Ruby bent to retrieve a dropped spoon, he found himself promptly escorted outside by Bronson and two others. He returned with a chastened expression and a split lip. "Won't happen again, Miss Collins," Bronson assured her gruffly, as if commenting on the weather rather than enforcement of respect. On Sunday afternoons, when camp activities slowed to a drowsy pace, Ruby worked in the small garden she'd established behind the cookhouse. The patch of turned earth became her refuge, a place to grow the chives, thyme, and mint that would enhance her cooking, but also a quiet sanctuary where she could think without interruption. Kneeling in the mountain soil one such afternoon, Ruby finally allowed herself to fully examine the pain of Edwin's rejection. The memory still stung. Public humiliation wasn't easily forgotten. But the acute anguish had dulled into something more contemplative. In Gold Hill, she'd been defined primarily by her relationship to others. Daniel Collins's daughter, Edwin Porter's fiancée, the girl with the excessive figure. Here at Silver Creek, she was simply Ruby the cook, valued for her skills and judged by her character rather than her curves. "You're looking pensive, Miss Ruby," old Pete observed, settling onto a stump nearby, his perpetual companion, resting across his knees. Over the weeks, he'd appointed himself her unofficial guardian and occasional confidant. Ruby sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Just thinking about how quickly life can change course, Mr. Pete. Like a creek after the spring melt," he agreed. "Carves itself a new path whether the rocks agree or not." Ruby smiled at his plain-spoken wisdom. "A month ago, I never would have imagined myself here." Pete's roomy eyes held surprising perception. Ain't my business to ask what drove you to a place no respectable woman would choose, but whatever it was, seems to me you're blossoming despite it, not wilting because of it. Ruby considered his words, realizing their truth. Her days were filled with honest work, her skills appreciated, her contributions recognized. The ache of Edwin's rejection had become less about losing him specifically and more about the public manner of it, an injury to pride rather than heart. I believe I am, she admitted, surveying her small garden with quiet satisfaction. Though I still have moments of wondering what comes next. This can't be forever. Pete chuckled, the sound like dry leaves rustling. None of us knows what comes next, girl. Most of these fellows dream of striking it rich and leaving. Some will, most won't. He gestured toward the mountains with his gnarled hand. But every day you choose your path. That's the only forever that matters. As June ripened toward July, Ruby found unexpected contentment in her mountain exile. Her cookhouse ran with efficient precision, her reputation for fair dealing and good food firmly established. She sent half her wages to her father each month, setting aside the remainder with a vague plan of eventually opening her own establishment, perhaps a boarding house or small restaurant where she could be her own mistress. The irony wasn't lost on her that in losing what Gold Hill deemed essential, a husband, respectability, a proper place in society, she had found something far more valuable: independence, self-respect, and the knowledge that she was fully capable of making her own way in the world. Each morning, as she kindled the cookhouse fire in pre-dawn darkness, Ruby felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with a man's approval, and everything to do with her own growing confidence. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in her life, uncertainty felt less like fear and more like possibility. July brought relentless heat to Silver Creek, the summer sun beating down on the mountain slopes with an intensity that drove men to seek shade during their brief rest periods. Even the cookhouse, despite Ruby's efforts to keep windows open for cross-ventilation, became stifling by midday. After serving the noon meal, a cold collation of salt pork, beans, and sourdough bread that required minimal cooking, Ruby found herself with an hour to spare before beginning dinner preparations. "You look ready to melt, girl," old Pete observed as he helped her clear the last of the dinner plates. "Why don't you take yourself a proper break? I can manage the washing up." Ruby wiped perspiration from her forehead with her apron hem. 6 weeks at Silver Creek had stripped away many of her ladylike pretensions, though she still maintained standards the miners found amusingly fussy. "Are you certain? There's 20 pounds of potatoes needing scrubbing for tonight's stew." Pete waved her concern away with a gnarled hand. "Got young Murphy assigned to kitchen duty today. Boy's useless in the mine, but handles a scrub brush well enough." The prospect of escape proved too tempting to resist. Ruby untied her apron, smoothed her hair, and reached for the small basket she used for gathering. "I've been wanting to look for wild mint up near the spring. I won't be gone above an hour. Take the path behind the assay office," Pete advised. "There's a stand of willows there that keeps the ground cooler. Might find some berries if you're lucky." Ruby felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she left the camp's noise and activity behind. The narrow trail wound upward through pines that offered blessed shade, the scent of sun-warmed needles filling her lungs with each deep breath. Birds called overhead, and once a rabbit darted across her path, startling a laugh from her that sounded almost foreign to her ears. When had she last laughed freely? She found wild mint growing in abundance near a small spring, its fragrance releasing as she carefully clipped stems and placed them in her basket. Nearby, columbines nodded their blue-purple heads in a light breeze, bringing a smile to Ruby's face. Even in this harsh landscape, beauty persisted. Refreshed by the cooler air at the higher elevation, Ruby ventured farther than she'd previously explored, following the spring's course as it trickled downward. 3 days earlier, a fierce thunderstorm had swept through the mountains, bringing much-needed rain, but also triggering minor slides on the steeper slopes. The landscape bore fresh scars from nature's fury: newly fallen trees, displaced boulders, and small gullies carved by rushing water. One such gully caught Ruby's attention as she picked her way carefully downslope. The recent rainfall had cut a channel nearly 3 feet deep through a section of hillside, exposing layers of soil and rock normally hidden beneath the surface. Something about the coloration of the newly exposed stone caught her eye, a faint yellowish tinge that seemed out of place among the predominant grays and browns. Ruby paused, setting her basket aside to examine the formation more closely. Growing up as a miner's daughter, she'd absorbed countless dinner conversations about ore quality, mineral indicators, and the signs that distinguished fool's gold from the genuine article. Her father had often brought home samples, explaining the characteristics that sparked hope in weary prospectors. "Look for quartz with rust stains, Ruby girl," Daniel Collins had told her once, holding a rock to the lamplight. "Where you find iron, you might find gold nearby. They keep company like gossiping old women at a church social." The memory brought a smile to Ruby's lips as she knelt by the gully, heedless of the dirt now staining her skirt. The exposed rock face indeed showed quartz, threaded with rust-colored streaks. Ruby glanced around instinctively, confirming she was alone before reaching out to touch the formation. The rock was surprisingly loose, the thunderstorm having done most of the work of freeing it from the surrounding soil. With minimal effort, Ruby dislodged a fist-sized sample, turning it over in her hands with growing excitement. Veins of quartz ran through the stone, and within those veins she could make out tiny flecks that caught the sunlight. "It couldn't be," she whispered to herself, heart suddenly hammering beneath her bodice. Not that easy. But the evidence rested in her palm, unmistakable to anyone who'd been raised in mining country. Ruby glanced again over her shoulder, a lifetime of hearing about claim jumpers and ore thieves suddenly making her paranoid. She was still within sight of the Silver Creek operation, though well beyond the main diggings. If she'd stumbled upon something valuable, she needed to proceed with caution. Working quickly, Ruby removed her handkerchief, one of the few feminine luxuries she'd retained in camp life, and wrapped the rock sample carefully. She collected 2 more specimens from different spots along the exposed vein, then artfully arranged broken branches and loose stones to make the site appear undisturbed. By the time she returned to the cookhouse, her cheeks were flushed with more than just the heat of the day. She slipped her precious cargo beneath her mattress before returning to her duties, her mind racing with possibilities as she mechanically peeled and chopped vegetables for the evening stew. That night, after the last miner had departed the cookhouse and camp had settled into its nighttime rhythm of snores and occasional bursts of laughter from the card games in the barracks, Ruby retreated to her small quarters. The room was little more than a boxed-off corner of the storage area, offering minimal privacy but blessed solitude after days spent in constant service to 30 hungry men. She retrieved her hidden samples and placed them on the small table beneath her window. The coal oil lamp cast a warm yellow glow as she unwrapped each specimen with trembling fingers. Her father had taught her the basic tests that any prospector would perform in the field. First, she examined the rocks visually, noting the telltale association of quartz and iron-stained minerals. Next, she took her small pocket knife and carefully scratched at one of the yellowish flecks. Real gold was soft enough to be marked by steel. Pyrite, fool's gold, was harder. The tiny fleck yielded to her blade, confirming the first test. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. For her final examination, she took the smallest sample and, using the back of her hairbrush, crushed it between 2 pieces of paper. Fool's gold would shatter into greenish-black powder. Real gold would flatten into shining flakes. When she carefully opened the paper, unmistakable golden flecks winked back at her in the lamplight. Ruby sank onto her narrow bed, the implications washing over her like a fever chill despite the summer heat. She had found gold, not just traces, but what appeared to be part of a proper vein, in an area the Western Mining Company presumably believed was played out since their operations centered on the opposite side of the camp. Questions tumbled through her mind in dizzying succession. Was the location part of the... If not, could she stake her own? How would she mine it without drawing attention? What rights did a woman have to file a claim in this part of California? Most pressing of all, whom could she trust with such explosive information? Ruby carefully rewrapped her samples and concealed them in a flour sack at the bottom of her trunk. She extinguished her lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountain wilderness mingling with the occasional cough or snore from the nearby barracks. Sleep eluded her as possibilities, both promising and dangerous, pirouetted through her consciousness like dancers glimpsed through a ballroom window. By dawn, one certainty had crystallized from her churning thoughts. Old Pete would know what to do. If anyone could help her navigate these treacherous waters, it would be the veteran miner, whose 50 years of experience had taught him every aspect of gold country law and custom. "You lookin' peaked this morning, Miss Ruby," Pete observed as he helped himself to coffee from the perpetually bubbling pot Ruby maintained near the cookhouse fireplace. "Didn't sleep well?" Ruby glanced around to ensure they were alone before responding. The early breakfast shift had departed for the mine, and the night workers wouldn't appear for another hour. "I need to speak with you privately, Mr. Pete. It's a delicate matter." Pete's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hat brim, but he simply nodded. "Supply shed in 20 minutes. I'll tell Prescott I'm inventory on blasting supplies." 20 minutes later, her morning bread dough set aside to rise, Ruby slipped into the cramped supply shed where mining equipment was stored. Pete was already there, perched on a crate of dynamite with a casualness that made Ruby wince. "Should you be sitting on that?" Pete chuckled. "Been using dynamite since before you were born, girl. It don't bite unless you light it." He gestured to a nearby barrel. "Close the door and have a seat. What's got you looking like you've seen the ghost of the 49ers? Ruby's hands trembled slightly as she withdrew the handkerchief-wrapped samples from her pocket. She placed them on a flat crate between them, carefully unwrapping each specimen. "I found these yesterday, up on the north slope where the thunderstorm cut that new gully." Pete's roomy eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, weathered hands reaching for the rocks with surprising gentleness. He turned each piece over, examining it from multiple angles in the shaft of sunlight that penetrated the shed's single grimy window. Without speaking, he produced a small magnifying glass from his vest pocket and studied the samples more intensely. After what seemed an eternity, he looked up at Ruby, his expression transformed from curious to astonished. "Where exactly did you find these?" Ruby described the location in detail. "Is it what I think it is? Gold, definitely." Pete's voice dropped to a whisper, though they were alone. "And not just any gold. Been prospecting 50 years, girl? That's no streak or pocket, that's a vein they missed." He gestured toward the main mine entrance, visible through the window. "Western mining's been focusing on the southern deposits. This could be a whole new formation." Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs. "Is it on company land?" Pete stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Property lines run along Hollister Creek, then up to the lightning-struck pine on the ridge. If you found this where I think you did, it's just outside their northern boundary." A slow grin split his weathered face. "Which means it's open for claiming by anyone sharp-eyed enough to stake it." "Can a woman file a mining claim?" Ruby asked, giving voice to her primary concern. "Law says any citizen over 21 can file," Pete replied. "Doesn't specify man or woman, though plenty would argue the intent, but with the right approach." He studied her thoughtfully. "You're of age?" 23 last March. "Then legally, there's nothing preventing you from staking a claim." Pete's expression grew more serious. "Practically, though, it's another matter. Woman filing alone would face challenges from every corner, claim jumpers, legal harassment, not to mention the physical work of proving the claim with required improvements." Ruby's momentary elation dimmed. "So it's impossible?" "Didn't say that." Pete tapped his gnarled finger against one of the samples. "Said it would be challenging. Difference between impossible and difficult is just a matter of strategy." He leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "You need a partner, Miss Ruby, someone who knows mining but isn't beholden to Western, someone who can help you file the paperwork properly and teach you enough about extraction to satisfy the claim requirements." "Someone like you?" Ruby ventured, hope rekindling. Pete's eyes twinkled. "Was hoping you'd see it that way. My mining days are mostly behind me. These hands can't grip a pickaxe like they used to, and my lungs protest the tunnel dust something fierce. But I've got knowledge aplenty, and Sacramento Land Office knows me well enough not to question my paperwork." Ruby considered the proposition, mind racing with implications. how would it work? I can't simply abandon my position here to go prospecting. No need to, not yet. Pete's voice took on the cadence of a man outlining a long-considered plan, though Ruby knew he was creating it as he spoke. First step is filing the claim securely. I'll ride to Sacramento on the next supply wagon. Told Prescott months ago I needed to see a doctor about my joints. Can handle the paperwork there, listing us as equal partners. And after that, we work smart, not obvious. Pete gestured toward the camp. You've got Sundays mostly to yourself. I'm considered too decrepit for regular shifts. Between us, we can manage initial improvements enough to secure the claim while we decide on longer plans. Ruby's practical nature asserted itself through her excitement. What of equipment? Supplies? I've saved some wages, but not enough for proper mining tools. Pete's chuckle held a conspiratorial note. Camp's got plenty of retired equipment Prescott thinks is beyond repair. I've been fixing bits and pieces in my spare time, force of habit from years when new tools were harder to come by. Got a serviceable sluice box, couple of pickaxes, enough to start small while keeping our expectations large. The old miner extended his hand across the crate, a gesture both formal and strangely touching. Partners, Miss Ruby? Your youth and determination, my experience and knowledge? Might be we could both find what we're looking for on that hillside. Ruby hesitated only briefly before clasping his gnarled fingers. Partners, Mr. Pete. The handshake sealed more than a mining agreement. In that moment, Ruby felt something she hadn't experienced since before Edwin Porter's public rejection. Genuine hope for a future shaped by her own choices rather than circumstances thrust upon her. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with risks both practical and social, but for the first time it felt like a path leading towards something rather than merely away from pain. We'll need to be careful, she cautioned, already thinking of potential complications. If Western Mining gets wind of this. They won't, Pete assured her, rewrapping the samples with surprising tenderness. Not until we're ready for them to know. Mining camp's got its own code, them against us, labor against owners. Men here respect you, Ruby. Respect what you've built from nothing. They won't betray you, especially to company men who rarely dirty their hands in the tunnels. Ruby nodded, allowing herself to imagine possibilities that had seemed beyond reach just days earlier. I should get back before I'm missed. Sunday's only 3 days away. We can talk more then. As she rose to leave, Pete touched her arm lightly. One question, if you don't mind. Why were you up on that slope at all? Most folks stick to the established paths. Ruby smiled, memories of her father's stories warming her voice. Pa always said the best finds come from looking where others don't bother to glance. He taught me to keep my eyes open, especially after rainfall washes landscapes clean. She gestured to the wrapped samples. Seems he was right. Wise man, your pa. Pete nodded approvingly. Might be his daughter inherited more than just his lessons. Ruby slipped back to her cookhouse, the morning's bread dough now risen and ready for shaping. As her hands worked the familiar task, her mind raced with newfound purpose. The Gold Hill humiliation that had once defined her now seemed distant, irrelevant to the woman she was becoming at Silver Creek. Edwin Porter had rejected her for a figure deemed too generous for a merchant's wife. How fitting that this same woman might now become a mine owner in her own right, a position that would render Edwin's mercantile success insignificant by comparison. The irony brought a smile to Ruby's lips as she punched down the dough with particular vigor. Something amusing about that bread, Miss Collins? Walter Prescott inquired, appearing unexpectedly in the cookhouse doorway. Ruby's smile never faltered as she continued kneading, just thinking about how life has a way of leading us to unexpected opportunities, Mr. Prescott. Don't you find that to be true? The camp manager eyed her curiously before shrugging. Can't say I've given it much thought. Long as my miners are fed and my ore quotas met, philosophy's a luxury I don't require. Perhaps you should try it sometime, Ruby suggested innocently. You never know what revelations might be waiting just beyond the established path. Chapter 3. Striking Gold. June-July 1870. The quarter moon hung like a silver coin in the vast mountain sky, casting just enough light for Ruby to make out old Pete's gnarled silhouette against the paler shape of the sluice box. They'd chosen this secluded hollow nearly half a mile from camp for their clandestine lessons, a spot where the creek's gentle murmur would cover any sounds of their activity. "Easy now," Pete cautioned as Ruby positioned the wooden trough at the proper angle. "Too steep and the water rushes through too fast, carries away the small flakes. Too shallow and nothing moves at all." Ruby adjusted the sluice with careful hands, her skirts already sodden at the hem from standing in the creek. She'd dispensed with her proper shoes after the first night, now wearing an old pair of boots borrowed from camp stores, 3 sizes too large and stuffed with rags to fit. The impropriety of a woman in men's footwear seemed a trivial concern compared to the business at hand. "Like this?" she asked, securing the sluice with river stones. Pete examined her work with approval. "Got a natural eye for it. Now for the riffle box." His arthritic fingers demonstrated how to position the removable tray with its series of crosswise slats. "Gold's heavy," he explained, not for the first time. 19 times heavier than water, near 8 times heavier than the sand and gravel. Water carries everything along, but gold settles behind these riffles, while lighter materials wash over. Ruby nodded, committing each detail to memory. "And the burlap lining helps catch the finest particles." "Smart girl." Pete handed her the small shovel they'd repaired in secret. "Start with 2 scoops from that gravel bar where the creek bends. That's where heavier materials naturally settle." Under Pete's watchful eye, Ruby worked the sluice as he'd taught her, carefully adding material and allowing the creek's flow to process it naturally. The monotonous rhythm became almost meditative in the quiet night, broken only by chirping crickets and the occasional hoot of a hunting owl. "How did you learn all this?" Ruby asked during a brief rest, flexing fingers stiff from the cold mountain water. Pete settled on a boulder, rubbing his knee where the dampness aggravated old mining injuries. "Started as a greenhorn in '49, just 17 and full of fool notions about getting rich quick. California was chaos then. Men from every corner of the world scrambling for color, killing themselves with work or each other over promising claims." His voice took on the cadence of memory. "Learned from a grizzled Mexican fellow who'd worked the Sonora mines. Man could find gold where others saw only dirt. Taught me to read the land, understand how water moves minerals, where to look when others give up." "Like my father," Ruby nodded. "He always said gold has its own particular habit of hiding where you'd least expect it." "Wise man." Pete glanced at the night sky. "Hour before moonset, time to check the riffles." With anticipated breath, Ruby carefully lifted the riffle box. In the dim moonlight, she tilted it slightly, allowing water to wash away loose sand. Behind each wooden slat, a thin line of black sand remained. And within that sand, unmistakable glints of yellow caught the meager light. "There it is," Pete whispered, respect in his voice. "Gold dust, right enough." Ruby's throat tightened with emotion as she stared at the tiny flecks representing her first real extraction. Not merely samples found by chance, but gold deliberately sought and captured through her own labor. Though modest in quantity, the symbolism overwhelmed her. Tangible proof she could shape her own destiny. "How do we separate it from the black sand?" she asked, voice husky. Pete produced a small copper pan from his satchel. "Final step of the night. Watch closely." His hands, despite their twisted joints, moved with practiced precision as he transferred the concentrated material to the pan. With circular motions just at the water's edge, he demonstrated how to swirl the contents, allowing water to carry away the lighter sand while the heavier gold remained. "Takes a gentle touch," he explained, "like dancing with a partner who's always trying to escape." Ruby's first attempts sent frustrating amounts of precious material over the pan's edge, but by the 3rd try, she'd begun to master the subtle rhythm. Pete's weathered face creased with approval as she eventually produced a small collection of gold flakes gathered at the pan's center. "That's the way," he nodded. "You've got the instinct for it." Over the following weeks, their midnight lessons expanded. Pete taught her to recognize promising quartz formations, to test rock samples with hammer and chisel, to place strategic claim markers that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Ruby proved an apt pupil, her childhood around miners providing foundation for the practical education. They established a careful routine. During her afternoon breaks, Ruby would visit their claim site, working efficiently for the hour she could spare. Pete created occasional diversions when necessary, accidentally spilling flour that required extensive cleanup, or engaging Prescott in lengthy discussions about supply inventories when the manager grew too curious about Ruby's whereabouts. By mid-July, their secret partnership had yielded its first significant success. Enough fine gold dust to fill a small leather pouch Pete had crafted from a worn-out boot top. The weight of it astonished Ruby when he placed it in her palm during one of their midnight consultations. "That's near 2 ounces, Pete estimated. "Worth about $35 at current rates. Not a fortune, but more than I earn in a month cooking," Ruby interrupted, voice hushed with wonder. The tangible weight in her palm represented more than monetary value. It was possibility, independence, vindication. That night, alone in her small quarters behind the cookhouse, Ruby held the leather pouch against her heart, feeling its weight as a counterbalance to the burden of humiliation she'd carried from Gold Hill. Edwin Porter had deemed her unsuitable to be his wife. His mother had orchestrated her social rejection. Yet here in her hand lay proof that Ruby Collins possessed value they'd never recognized: determination, intelligence, and now the beginnings of her own wealth. Sleep eluded her as she imagined possibilities: a proper restaurant in Sacramento, perhaps, or a boarding house catering to respectable travelers, or maybe, with enough success, a triumphant return to Gold Hill, not as a humiliated former fiancée, but as a woman of independent means whose excessive figure could be draped in the finest fabrics money could buy. This small pouch of gold dust, earned through her own efforts, was the first tangible step toward a future of her own making. August arrived with relentless heat that baked the mining camp to dusty discomfort. Ruby had just pulled a batch of biscuits from the cookhouse oven, her face flushed from exertion and temperature, when a commotion outside drew her attention. She wiped flour-covered hands on her apron and stepped onto the small porch that fronted her domain. A crowd had gathered near the camp office, miners abandoning their tasks to cluster around something Ruby couldn't yet see. Even Prescott had emerged, his customary stern expression replaced by uncommon alertness. Ruby shaded her eyes against the glaring sun, curiosity overcoming her reluctance to abandon half-prepared dinner. "What's happened?" she asked young Murphy, who dashed past with unusual animation. "Fancy visitor," the normally shy miner answered eagerly, riding the finest horse I've seen since leaving Kentucky. Ruby moved closer, maintaining a proper distance from the crowd of dusty miners. Through gaps between broad shoulders, she caught sight of the cause of disruption: a tall stranger dismounting from a magnificent black stallion that indeed seemed out of place in the utilitarian surroundings of Silver Creek. The man himself appeared equally out of place: tailored dark trousers tucked into polished boots, a crisp white shirt beneath a black vest, and a matching black Stetson that he removed as he shook Prescott's hand. Unlike the camp manager's perpetually sunburned complexion, the stranger's face maintained the indoor pallor of a man who conducted business in offices rather than mine shafts. Yet despite his citified appearance, there was nothing soft about him. Even from a distance, Ruby noted the breadth of his shoulders, the easy way he controlled his spirited mount, the watchful alertness with which he surveyed the gathered miners. This was no pampered businessman, but a man comfortable in multiple worlds. Prescott's voice carried across the yard as he instructed several miners to care for the visitor's horse and luggage. Moments later, he led the stranger toward the camp office, the crowd reluctantly dispersing back to assigned tasks. Ruby returned to her kitchen, curiosity unsatisfied, but dinner preparations demanding attention. Within minutes, Bronson appeared at her doorway, eager to share the camp gossip. "Name's Jackson Blackwell," he reported, accepting the coffee Ruby offered as pretense for his visit. "Represents some fancy mining consortium from San Francisco." Prescott nearly swallowed his tongue, being polite. "What's his business here?" Ruby asked, trying to sound merely conversationally interested while slicing salt pork. Bronson shrugged his massive shoulders. "Claims to be surveying regional operations. Consortium's looking to expand holdings." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Some fellows think he's really here to evaluate the camp for purchase. Western Mining might be selling out." Ruby's knife paused momentarily. Would that affect the men's positions? New owners always bring changes, Bronson replied philosophically. Might mean better equipment. Might mean pay cuts. Might mean nothing at all. He drained his coffee cup. Thing's certain. Prescott's put him in the good cabin usually reserved for company directors. Man's clearly important. By dinner time, Ruby had heard a dozen variations of speculation about Jackson Blackwell's purpose at Silver Creek. She'd also, somewhat to her annoyance, found herself taking extra care with the evening meal and her own appearance. She'd changed her flour-dusted apron for a clean one and pinned back several escaped tendrils of hair before catching herself with irritation. What did it matter how she looked, serving dinner to a San Francisco businessman who probably viewed a mining camp cook as barely more significant than the camp's mules? The dinner bell had barely finished ringing when the cookhouse door opened to admit Prescott and his distinguished guest. The camp manager's posture radiated unusual deference as he introduced Blackwell to various miners already seated at the long tables. Ruby busied herself at the serving counter, ladling stew into bowls with practiced efficiency while keeping her gaze carefully averted from the stranger. Only when Prescott approached with Blackwell in tow did she finally look up, directly into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever encountered. "Ms. Collins, this is Mr. Jackson Blackwell from Occidental Mining Consortium," Prescott announced with uncharacteristic formality. "Mr. Blackwell, our camp cook, Miss Ruby Collins, Miss Collins." Blackwell removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a slight wave that suggested it would curl if grown longer. His voice matched his appearance, cultured but with an underlying firmness that hinted at authority accustomed to being respected. "Mr. Blackwell." Ruby nodded politely, suddenly conscious of her work-reddened hands and the wisps of hair that had escaped their pins despite her efforts. "I hope you'll find our simple fare satisfying after your journey." A slight smile curved his mouth beneath a neatly trimmed mustache. "Other 5 hours on mountain trails, Miss Collins, I'd find hardtack and coffee satisfying. This," he gestured to the steaming bowls of fragrant stew, "smells like heaven itself." The compliment, delivered with apparent sincerity rather than empty courtesy, caught Ruby off guard. She found herself momentarily flustered, an unfamiliar sensation that irritated her independent nature. "It's venison stew. One of the miners brought down a deer yesterday. Then I'm doubly fortunate in my timing." Blackwell accepted the bowl she handed him, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through Ruby's chest that she immediately tried to dismiss as foolishness. Throughout dinner, Ruby maintained her usual efficient management of the cookhouse, circulating with coffee refills and additional biscuits as needed. Yet she remained uncomfortably aware of Jackson Blackwell's presence at the head table, particularly when she sensed his gaze following her movements. Once, delivering fresh coffee to Prescott, she glanced up to find Blackwell watching her with undisguised interest. Not the demeaning appraisal she'd grown accustomed to from men encountering a woman in a mining camp, but something more measured and thoughtful. When their eyes met briefly across the room, that unwelcome flutter returned to her chest with greater intensity. Ruby turned away quickly, retreating to the safety of her kitchen domain. Whatever Jackson Blackwell's purpose at Silver Creek, she determined to give him no particular notice. She had secrets to protect, a claim to develop in precious stolen hours, and a future to build that required focus and discretion. The last thing Ruby Collins needed was the complication of a handsome stranger with piercing blue eyes and the power to potentially upend everything she and old Pete had worked to establish. The cookhouse gradually emptied as miners finished their meals and drifted toward the bunkhouse or evening card games. Ruby gathered abandoned plates with practiced efficiency, mentally calculating how long cleanup would take before she could retreat to her private quarters. The day had been unusually taxing, not just the physical labor of preparing meals for 30 hungry men, but the unexpected disruption of Jackson Blackwell's arrival and the unwelcome awareness his presence had sparked in her. "May I be of assistance, Miss Collins?" Ruby nearly dropped the stack of plates at the sound of Blackwell's voice behind her. She turned to find him still seated at the table near the serving counter, his hat placed neatly beside him. The other diners had departed, even Prescott, leaving them unexpectedly alone. "That's not necessary, Mr. Blackwell," she managed, surprised by the steadiness of her voice despite her sudden nerves. I'm quite accustomed to managing on my own." "I've no doubt of that." His smile revealed a small dimple in his right cheek, lending boyish charm to his otherwise commanding presence. "But my mother raised me never to leave a lady to clear away my dishes." Before Ruby could protest further, he rose and gathered the remaining cups from the table. "Where shall I put these?" The situation was so unprecedented that Ruby found herself momentarily speechless. No visitor, certainly no gentleman, had ever offered to help with cookhouse chores. Even Prescott and the miners respected the unspoken boundary between her domain and theirs. "The washing basin is by the stove," she finally directed, deciding that arguing would consume more energy than simply allowing his peculiar gesture. Blackwell rolled up his sleeves with methodical precision, revealing forearms corded with muscle that belied his city attire. Ruby busied herself scraping plates, determined not to stare at the unexpected sight of a well-dressed businessman preparing to wash dishes. "You've created quite an efficient operation here," he commented, testing the water temperature before adding soap flakes. "The miners speak highly of your cooking." "Do they?" Ruby couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "They're not generally forthcoming with compliments to my face." Blackwell chuckled, the sound unexpectedly warm in the utilitarian kitchen. "Men in groups rarely express appreciation directly, but I assure you, several described your arrival as salvation from Old Joe's shoe leather biscuits." Despite her determination to maintain formal distance, Ruby felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Old Joe's reputation precedes him. I've found evidence of his culinary disasters in every corner of this kitchen." They fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Ruby scraping and stacking, Blackwell washing, and both drying the growing pile of clean dishes. The domesticity of the scene struck Ruby as surreal. Had anyone told her that morning she'd be washing dishes with a San Francisco mining executive, she'd have questioned their sanity. "How does a Boston man find himself representing a San Francisco mining consortium?" Ruby asked, curiosity overcoming caution. If Blackwell was surprised by her direct question or her detection of his origins, he didn't show it. "You have a good ear, Miss Collins. Most Californians simply label my accent Eastern without further distinction. My mother was from Massachusetts," Ruby explained. "The vowels remain distinctive to those familiar with them." "Indeed." He handed her a dripping plate. "To answer your question, ambition, opportunity, and a streak of restlessness that family shipping interests couldn't satisfy. I came west after the war, worked mining operations in Nevada, and eventually caught the attention of investors looking for someone who understood both the practical and business aspects of mining." As they worked, Blackwell described San Francisco with vivid detail: the grand hotels along Market Street, the competing architectural styles as the city rebuilt after devastating fires, the cosmopolitan mix of cultures and languages that made it unlike any other American city. "The Palace Hotel nears completion," he told her, eyes lighting with genuine enthusiasm. 6 stories of architectural marvel with interior garden courts. Every room will have its own window." Ruby found herself captivated not just by his descriptions, but by his evident appreciation for beauty and innovation. This was no dry businessman focused solely on profit margins. Jackson Blackwell observed the world with attentive eyes and described it with unexpected eloquence. "It sounds magnificent," she murmured, her imagination painting pictures of luxury and elegance, far removed from her current surroundings. "Perhaps you'll see it someday," he suggested, handing her the last clean cup. "San Francisco welcomes those with entrepreneurial spirit regardless of background. I've seen former miners become bankers, immigrants become restaurant owners, and determined women establish successful millinery shops and boarding houses." The subtle encouragement in his words caught Ruby by surprise. Unlike most men of her acquaintance, he seemed to assume her ambitions extended beyond domestic arrangements. "I do have certain aspirations beyond cookhouse management," she admitted carefully, conscious of revealing too much. "I suspected as much." His blue eyes studied her with interest. "You strike me as a woman with plans, Miss Collins." They reached for the same pot simultaneously, their hands colliding in a moment of unexpected contact. Ruby felt the jolt of awareness like a physical current, warm and alarming in equal measure. Blackwell's expression suggested he'd felt it too, his gaze sharpening with sudden intensity. Ruby stepped backward hastily, directly into the water bucket she'd placed behind her. It toppled with a spectacular splash, sending soapy water across the plank floor. She let out an uncharacteristic yelp as the cold water soaked her boots and the hem of her skirt. "Oh, clumsy of me. Let me help." They both knelt to right the bucket, their faces suddenly inches apart in the confined space between counter and stove. Ruby found herself frozen, acutely aware of his proximity. The faint scent of sandalwood and leather, the slight shadow of evening beard darkening his jaw, the surprising length of his eyelashes as his gaze dropped briefly but unmistakably to her lip. For one breathless moment, Ruby thought he might close the distance between them. Even more alarming was the realization that some traitorous part of her hoped he would. A deliberate cough from the doorway shattered the moment. They both looked up to find old Pete leaning on his cane, his rheumy eyes taking in the scene with shrewd assessment. "Evening, Miss Ruby. Mr. Blackwell." Pete's voice carried exaggerated innocence. "Came to see if you needed any help closing up, but it seems you've got assistance aplenty." Ruby scrambled to her feet, mortification heating her cheeks. "Mr. Pete, we've had a small accident with the water bucket." "So I see." Pete's expression remained neutral, though Ruby detected a hint of protective concern beneath his casual tone. "Happy to mop up while you finish the rest of your duties?" Blackwell rose with fluid grace, seemingly unperturbed by the interruption or the dampness now soaking his trouser legs. "The spill was my fault entirely, Mr. Peterson. I was just telling Miss Collins how impressed I am with the improvements she's made to camp operations." Pete's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "That's so? Well, she's certainly brought civilization to this wilderness, though some of us old-timers still struggle with the concept of washing behind our ears daily." The gentle self-deprecation broke the lingering tension. Blackwell chuckled, retrieving his hat from the table. "I'll leave you to your evening routine, Miss Collins. Thank you for both the excellent meal and the enlightening conversation." He nodded respectfully to Pete before exiting into the gathering dusk. Ruby immediately busied herself with the remaining dishes, avoiding Pete's knowing gaze. "Mighty helpful for a city man," Pete observed mildly, reaching for the mop kept behind the door. "He was merely being polite," Ruby replied, her tone sharper than intended. Pete began absorbing the spilled water with methodical strokes. "And I'm merely observing that gentlemen from San Francisco don't typically help with kitchen chores unless they have particular interest in the cook." Ruby snapped a dish towel with unnecessary force. "His presence here threatens everything we're working toward, Mr. Pete. The last thing I need is complications." Say otherwise." Pete's voice softened. "Just be careful, Ruby girl. Men like that operate in a different world than the likes of us. Their games have different stakes." Ruby nodded, grateful for his concern, yet irritated by the flutter of awareness that persisted despite her determination to ignore it. Jackson Blackwell was dangerous, not because of any deliberate threat, but because he represented exactly the kind of distraction she couldn't afford while building her precarious future. By late July, Ruby had established a routine that balanced her cookhouse responsibilities with her secret mining activities. Prescott had grown accustomed to her taking Thursday afternoons off, ostensibly to gather wild herbs and plants from the surrounding hillsides. "Woman's entitled to some personal time," he'd declared when one newer miner questioned her regular absence. "Keeps this crew better fed than we deserve." This particular Thursday found Ruby carefully wrapping her latest gold extraction in soft chamois cloth before tucking it into a hidden pocket sewn into her petticoat. The small leather pouches had multiplied over the weeks into a modest but impressive collection. With old Pete's guidance, she'd refined her techniques until even he expressed surprise at her efficiency. "You've got the touch, no question," he'd told her after their most recent extraction. "Some folks mine for decades without developing your instinct for where gold hides." The monthly supply wagon would leave for Sacramento the following morning, with Pete aboard under the pretense of another doctor's visit for his arthritis. In truth, he would convert their accumulated gold into cash and deposit most of it in the Sacramento River Bank, where Ruby had opened an account under her own name during their first profitable month. Ruby checked her reflection in the small mirror nailed to her wall, adjusting her bonnet to ensure she looked presentable but not conspicuous. Her monthly herb-gathering expeditions had become legitimate enough that she now sold small bundles of medicinal plants to miners and occasionally to travelers passing through. The modest enterprise provided perfect cover for her more significant business interest. "Ready for your nature walk, Miss Collins?" Bronson called good-naturedly as she crossed the camp yard with her gathering basket. The massive miner had appointed himself her unofficial protector in recent months. "Indeed, Mr. Bronson. I've had requests for more of that willow bark tea that helped your toothache. Worked better than whiskey." Ruby smiled and continued toward the trail that would eventually lead her to the hidden claim. Once certain she wasn't observed, she diverted from the main path, making her way through dense underbrush until she reached the small clearing where old Pete awaited. "Brought the new equipment," he announced proudly, displaying several tools he'd acquired during their last Sacramento trip. "Proper mining pan, rock hammer, and those canvas bags you wanted for ore samples?" Ruby examined each item with satisfaction. The growing success of their venture had allowed for incremental investments in better equipment. Nothing extravagant enough to draw attention, but significant improvements over their initial makeshift tools. "Any word on our claim paperwork?" she asked, already reaching for the leather gloves that protected her hands during their work. Pete nodded, lowering his voice, though they were far from eavesdroppers. "Officially registered and recorded. Paid the extra $1 to have a copy sent to your bank box rather than your name at camp. Far as anyone official's concerned, the Ruby Gulch mining claim belongs legal and proper to Ruby Collins and Peter Peterson, equal partners." "Ruby Gulch?" She raised an eyebrow, amused at the name she hadn't chosen. Pete shrugged, a hint of color touching his weathered cheeks. Had to call it something. Seemed fitting, considering who found it. The unexpected sentiment touched Ruby deeply. "It's perfect, Mr. Pete." They worked together with practiced efficiency for several hours, extracting promising ore samples and processing smaller batches through the improved sluice system Pete had designed. Though the work remained physically demanding, Ruby found satisfaction in each aspect. From identifying promising rock formations to the meticulous panning that revealed glittering specks and occasional small nuggets. As they packed up their equipment before Ruby needed to return to prepare dinner, Pete handed her a folded newspaper he'd kept in his jacket. "Banking column might interest you," he suggested casually. "Been keeping track of our deposits." Ruby scanned the indicated section, her eyes widening at the simple calculation Pete had penciled in the margin. Between their combined deposits over recent months, they now had nearly $800 in the Sacramento Bank, a sum that represented more money than Ruby had ever possessed at one time. "This is," she began, finding words inadequate. "Just the beginning," Pete finished for her, eyes twinkling. "At this rate, by year's end, you could have enough for a down payment on a small business establishment. That restaurant you've mentioned, perhaps?" Ruby sat on a fallen log, suddenly overwhelmed by the tangible reality of dreams that had once seemed distant fantasies. In the months since Edwin Porter's cruel rejection, she had transformed from humiliated almost bride to independent businesswoman with growing financial security. "I could lease space in Auburn or Grass Valley," she mused, allowing herself to articulate ambitions usually kept private. "A proper eating establishment with clean linens and respectable clientele. Perhaps rooms for rent above?" Pete nodded encouragingly. "Got the skills for it, no question. And the determination." Ruby carefully refolded the newspaper, tucking it into her basket beneath the gathered herbs. "I'd want you involved somehow, Mr. Pete. Your expertise and friendship have made all this possible." The old miner blinked rapidly, emotion briefly overtaking his usual pragmatism. "Been thinking I might retire from hard mining once this venture pays out proper. Could use a position that respects these old bones. Establishment manager, perhaps?" Ruby impulsively reached out to squeeze his gnarled hand. "Partners in everything, Mr. Pete. from Ruby Gulch to whatever comes next. As they walked back toward camp, deliberately taking separate paths to avoid suspicion, Ruby felt a lightness in her spirit that had nothing to do with the gold hidden in her petticoat pocket. The weight of Edwin's rejection, once so crushing, had been replaced by the steadier, more substantial weight of self-determination. Each step carried her further from the woman who had once measured her worth through a man's approval, and closer to the woman she was becoming, one who created her own opportunities and built her future with her own hands, regardless of whether that future included a broad-shouldered mining executive with unsettlingly perceptive blue eyes. Jackson Blackwell's visit to Silver Creek extended from days into weeks, his presence becoming an unexpected fixture in camp routine. Prescott announced that the Occidental Mining Consortium was conducting a thorough assessment of regional operations, requiring Blackwell's continued oversight. The miners speculated endlessly about potential changes, their whispered conversations silencing whenever Blackwell appeared. August brought a rare Saturday evening of leisure as a depleted dynamite supply halted evening tunnel work. The miners gathered around campfires outside the barracks, passing bottles of whiskey and engaging in spirited card games. Ruby had provided a special supper of venison stew and dried apple pie, earning gruff appreciation from men who rarely acknowledged the comfort her cooking brought to their harsh existence. She stood at the cookhouse doorway, watching the gathering with a curious mixture of belonging and separation. After 3 months at Silver Creek, she knew each miner's stories, preferences, and peculiarities, yet remained apart, the only woman in a masculine domain where certain boundaries could never be crossed. "Not joining the festivities, Miss Collins?" Ruby turned to find Jackson Blackwell approaching, his tall figure silhouetted against the twilight sky. In deference to camp life, he'd modified his attire over the weeks, the fine suit replaced by sturdy trousers and cotton shirts, though he somehow maintained an air of distinction despite the concession to practicality. "I provide the food, Mr. Blackwell. Participation isn't expected," Ruby replied, more aware than she wished to be of his proximity in the gathering darkness. "A shame. I suspect you'd be formidable at cards." His smile flashed white in the dusk. "Would you consider a short walk? The evening's pleasant, and I find myself craving conversation beyond mining specifications and ore quality." Caution warred with curiosity in Ruby's mind. Since their interrupted moment in the kitchen, she'd maintained a careful distance, limiting their interactions to necessary exchanges during meals. Yet something in his straightforward request disarmed her usual defenses. "A short walk," she agreed, reaching inside for her shawl. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Blackwell, any miner spotting us strolling alone will feed the camp gossip mill for weeks." He chuckled, offering his arm with formal courtesy. "Then perhaps we should give them something worth discussing. Shall we scandalously examine the new ore carts by moonlight?" Ruby found herself smiling, despite her determination to remain aloof. She ignored his proffered arm, but fell into step beside him, maintaining a proper distance as they walked toward the clearing beyond the main camp, where new equipment awaited installation. The night had transformed Silver Creek into a place of unexpected beauty. Moonlight silvered the pine trees surrounding camp, while stars emerged in brilliant profusion across the velvet sky, so numerous and bright they seemed close enough to touch. The mountain air carried the scent of pine resin and distant wildflowers, cool enough to refresh after the day's lingering heat. "I've traveled extensively throughout California's mining regions," Jackson remarked as they reached the clearing, "but few places rivaled this landscape for sheer magnificence." "It does possess a certain wild beauty," Ruby acknowledged, tilting her head back to admire the stars. "Though I imagine it pales beside San Francisco's sophisticated charms." Jackson laughed softly. "The city has its appeal, certainly. Theaters, restaurants, the comfort of civilization. But there's something honest about places like Silver Creek. No pretense, no social machinations, just human endeavor against nature's challenges." They settled on a fallen log with tacit agreement, far enough apart to maintain propriety, yet close enough for comfortable conversation. The miners' distant laughter occasionally carried on the night breeze, a reminder of civilization not quite out of reach. "You speak like a man who's known both worlds intimately," Ruby observed. Something in her comment seemed to reach him. Jackson was silent for a moment, his profile contemplative in the moonlight. That's perceptive of you, Miss Collins, and accurate. He turned slightly, his expression more open than she'd yet witnessed. I was born in Boston's North End, not to the shipping fortune many assume, but to an Irish immigrant father who worked the docks, and a mother who took in laundry from dawn to dusk. The revelation surprised Ruby. His refined speech and confident bearing suggested privileged origins, yet you're clearly educated. My mother insisted. Sacrificed everything to keep me in school when my father would have put me to work at 12. A shadow crossed his features. After he died in a dock accident, I did both school by day, various jobs by night. Eventually earned a scholarship to Harvard, where I learned to mimic the speech and manners of men born to wealth I couldn't imagine. That explains the discrepancy, Ruby mused. You move in sophisticated circles, but observe them with an outsider's clarity. Jackson studied her with renewed interest. You're remarkably perceptive, Miss Collins. Most people accept the facade without questioning. Perhaps it takes one who's crafted their own adaptations to recognize another's, she replied, immediately regretting the revealing comment. Indeed, his voice warmed. I've wondered about your story since arriving. A woman of obvious intelligence and refinement cooking for miners in this remote outpost. He left the question unspoken but evident. Ruby weighed her response carefully. Life sometimes takes unexpected turns, Mr. Blackwell. 6 months ago, I had a very different future planned. When it collapsed, I pursued the only immediate opportunity available. With remarkable success, from what I've observed. His admiration seemed genuine rather than patronizing. The miners speak of the camp's transformation since your arrival. Not just improved meals, but overall morale and functionality. Ruby acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod, uncomfortable with praise, yet unwilling to diminish her accomplishments. I believe in doing thoroughly whatever task presents itself. I recognize that quality. It's the same hunger that drove me west after completing my education, the determination to build something meaningful through one's own efforts. Jackson shifted slightly, his expression earnest in the moonlight. It's actually why I sought you out tonight. I have a proposition I'd like you to consider. Ruby tensed imperceptibly. A proposition, Mr. Blackwell? A business proposition, he clarified, perhaps sensing her wariness. I've been authorized to explore new ventures beyond the consortium's current holdings. You've demonstrated exceptional capability and knowledge of this region, its resources, its people, its potential. The direction of his thoughts both relieved and alarmed Ruby. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I'm proposing a partnership, Jackson stated directly. I have capital and connections. You possess local knowledge and practical insight that can't be acquired from mining reports. Together, we could identify promising opportunities, perhaps a hotel serving the increasing traffic between Sacramento and the high country, or properly managed claims overlooked by larger operations. Ruby's mind raced. His suggestion bordered uncomfortably close to her secret activities with old Pete. Was this coincidence, or had he somehow discovered their claim? That's unexpected, Mr. Blackwell. Jackson, please. Business partners should dispense with formalities. He smiled, enthusiasm evident in his voice. Consider it, Ruby. You're clearly destined for more than perpetual kitchen duty, brilliant though your cooking may be. You know very little about me, she protested, though a traitorous part of her warmed at his confidence in her abilities. I know enough. I've watched you manage complex logistics with minimal resources, maintain authority without resorting to harshness, and earn genuine respect from men who rarely offer it freely. His gaze held hers steadily. Those qualities are exceedingly rare and immensely valuable in any enterprise. The sincerity in his voice momentarily stripped away Ruby's defenses. How long had it been since anyone, especially a man, had recognized her capabilities rather than her physical attributes or domestic skills? Edwin Porter had valued her bookkeeping abilities, but never envisioned her as a true partner. Yet this near stranger spoke of her potential as if it were self-evident. I appreciate your confidence, but I need time to consider, she finally answered, unwilling to reveal how his words had affected her. My current situation has complexities. Of course. Jackson accepted her hesitation without pressing further. The offer remains open. Think on it. No urgency. As they rose to return to camp, a sudden breeze lifted a strand of hair across Ruby's face. Without hesitation, Jackson reached out, gently tucking it behind her ear. The gesture, brief and seemingly unconscious, sent a current of awareness through Ruby that far outweighed its innocence. His fingers lightly brushed her cheek, lingering for only a heartbeat but leaving an imprint of warmth that remained long after contact ended. "Good night, Ruby," he said softly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Thank you for the conversation. It's been illuminating." Ruby watched him walk toward the guest cabin, her composed "Good night, Mr. Blackwell" belying the turmoil beneath. That small touch, the casual intimacy of it, had awakened sensations she'd never experienced during Edwin's proper courtship. Months of carefully maintained independence threatened to crumble under the weight of a simple, tucked strand of hair. That night, sleep proved elusive as Ruby's thoughts circled restlessly. Jackson's business proposition intertwined with memories of his touch, practical considerations tangling with unwelcome yearnings. When she finally succumbed to exhaustion, her dreams betrayed her. Strong hands, blue eyes, and a voice that spoke of partnership rather than possession. September arrived with the dramatic flourish of mountain weather, clear mornings yielding to afternoon thunderheads that built like massive fortresses on the horizon. Ruby had volunteered to accompany Hank on a supply run to a neighboring settlement, hoping to deliver a small pouch of gold dust to Pete's contact there without arousing suspicion. "Weather's turning," Hank observed as they loaded the final purchases into the wagon. "Might want to wrap that flower extra careful." Ruby glanced at the darkening western sky, calculating distances and time. "We should reach the river crossing before the worst hits. The camp needs these supplies." Hank shrugged, knowing better than to argue with the cook's determination. "Your call, Miss Collins. Just don't expect me to fish you out if you blow away in the storm." They departed immediately, the wagon creaking under its load as they navigated the rutted trail connecting isolated mining settlements. Ruby had completed her business discreetly, exchanging her gold for bank drafts concealed in the hidden pocket of her skirts. The transaction brought her total savings to nearly $1,000, an amount that still astonished her when she dwelt upon it. The storm advanced faster than anticipated, dark clouds swallowing the afternoon sun as distant lightning flickered between peaks. Wind gusted through pine boughs, bringing the sharp scent of approaching rain. When the first heavy drops spattered the wagon canvas, Hank flicked the reins with greater urgency. "River's just ahead," he called over the rising wind. "If it's running high, we might need to wait it out." The normally placid creek that separated the settlements from Silver Creek had transformed during their brief absence. Swollen by upstream rainfall, it churned muddy and swift across the usual ford, carrying small branches and debris in its current. Hank pulled the team to a halt at the crossing, squinting through sheets of rain that now fell steadily. "Don't like the look of it," he muttered, "but going back means adding hours to our journey." "The supplies won't last through a night in this downpour," Ruby pointed out, rain already soaking through her cloak, "and the camp needs the medicine for Thompson's fever." Decision made, Hank urged the reluctant horses forward into the churning water. The wagon lurched as the current caught its wheels, water rising halfway up the spokes. For several tense moments, they made steady, if slow, progress toward the far bank. Without warning, a massive log swept downstream, striking the lead horse with enough force to snap the harness traces. The animal whinnied in terror, struggling against the current as its partner panicked. The wagon tilted precariously, water now reaching the floorboards. "Hold tight," Hank shouted, fighting to control the remaining horse as the freed animal swam frantically toward shore. Ruby clutched the seat with white-knuckled hands, the precious supplies forgotten as survival instinct took precedence. Through the curtain of rain, she glimpsed movement on the far shore. A rider pushing his mount into the rushing water, heading directly toward their stranded wagon. "Help's coming!" she called to Hank, who nodded grimly while bracing the wagon with his considerable strength. The horseman approached with skill that spoke of extensive riding experience, guiding his mount through the treacherous current with precise commands. As he drew alongside the tilting wagon, Ruby recognized Jackson Blackwell. his fine city clothes exchanged for practical oilskin that shed water like a duck's feathers. "Take my hand," he shouted above the storm's roar, extending his arm toward Ruby. "The wagon won't hold much longer." She hesitated only briefly before grasping his outstretched hand. With surprising strength, Jackson pulled her from the seat onto his horse, settling her before him in the saddle. One arm wrapped securely around her waist, while the other maintained control of the reins. "Hank?" she called, twisting to see the driver. "I'll manage," Hank assured her, already climbing onto the remaining horse's back after cutting it free from the wagon. "Save the supplies if you can." Jackson guided his horse toward a submerged supply crate bobbing dangerously near the wagon. With remarkable coordination, Ruby leaned down to grab its rope handle while Jackson maintained their balance. Together they maneuvered toward the shore, the horse fighting the current with powerful strokes. By the time they reached the safety of the bank, rain fell in blinding sheets. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the scene in stark flashes. The abandoned wagon now completely on its side, Hank dragging a second crate to shore, the horses shaking with exhaustion and fear. "There's a line shack just beyond those trees," Jackson called to Hank. "Get the horses there. We'll bring what supplies we salvaged." Ruby found herself trembling, whether from cold or delayed fear, she couldn't determine. Her sodden dress weighed heavily, clinging to her curves in a manner that would be scandalous in normal circumstances. But as Jackson lifted her down from the horse, his strong hands spanning her waist, propriety seemed a distant concern compared to their narrow escape. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he searched her face. "When I saw the wagon tilting," he broke off, seemingly unable to complete the thought. "I thought you might be lost." The raw concern in his expression stripped away Ruby's carefully maintained defenses. Standing in the pouring rain, soaked to the skin and shaking with reaction, she recognized the tenuous nature of life's certainties. How quickly plans and caution could be swept away like the wagon in the flood. Jackson's hands still held her waist, neither of them moving to increase the proper distance that months of careful interaction had maintained. Rainwater streamed down his face, plastering dark hair to his forehead and emphasizing the stark angles of his features. His eyes never left hers, something unspoken but unmistakable building between them. "Ruby," he said simply, her name carrying questions he didn't articulate. She never knew whether she moved first or he did. Perhaps they gravitated toward each other simultaneously, inevitability rather than conscious choice. His lips found hers with gentle pressure that quickly deepened as months of restrained awareness crystallized into undeniable attraction. The kiss transformed from tentative to urgent, his arms pulling her closer as her hands found their way to his shoulders. The cold of the rain receded before the heat blooming between them, rendering irrelevant the water streaming down their faces. Ruby felt herself responding with an intensity that shocked her, years of proper restraint dissolving under the dual assault of danger survived and desire finally acknowledged. Jackson kissed her with focused attention that suggested she was precious rather than convenient, his hands respectful even in passion. When his fingers threaded through her rain-soaked hair, cradling her head with unexpected tenderness, something tightened in Ruby's chest, a recognition that this was fundamentally different from anything she'd experienced before. A tremendous crack of thunder directly overhead finally broke them apart, both breathing heavily as reality reasserted itself. Ruby stepped back, stunned by her own response and the implications of what had just transpired. Jackson's expression mirrored her confusion. Desire mingled with surprise at its intensity. The supplies," Ruby gestured vaguely toward the crates, struggling to reclaim her practical nature. "Yes," Jackson agreed, though his eyes conveyed more complex thoughts. "We should get to shelter." As they gathered the salvaged supplies and headed toward the lined shack where Hank awaited, Ruby felt fundamentally altered. Not by the near disaster of the crossing, but by the revelation of her own capacity for passion. The careful barriers she'd constructed around her heart had been breached, not through slow erosion, but in one overwhelming rush, like the floodwaters that had nearly claimed them. The lined shack proved to be little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank floor, and minimal furnishings. Hank had already started a fire, its welcome warmth pushing back the chill of their soaked clothing. "Wagon's a loss," he announced without preamble as they entered with the rescued supplies. "Saved what I could, but half our load's gone downstream." "The medicine?" Ruby asked, practicality reasserting itself despite her inner turmoil. Hank patted a small waterproof packet. "Got it here. Thompson won't die on my account." "You both showed remarkable courage," Jackson said, setting down the crate he'd carried. "That crossing would have defeated most Teamsters." Hank shrugged off the compliment with typical modesty. "Been through worse. Though I'll admit, having you show up was providential timing, Mr. Blackwell." Jackson busied himself arranging the salvage supplies, avoiding Ruby's gaze with sudden intentness. "I was returning from checking boundary markers. Heard the wagon in trouble and recognized Miss Collins." The space within the shack felt impossibly confined as Ruby became acutely aware of her sodden clothing clinging to her figure, her hair falling in wet ropes around her shoulders after losing its pins to the river. She wrapped her arms around herself, as much for modesty as warmth. "There's an old blanket on that shelf." Hank nodded toward a crude storage area. "Might want to wrap up before you catch your death, Miss Collins. Storms set in for the night by the sound of it." The implications of their situation slowly registered. They were stranded until morning, one woman and two men in a single-room shelter with nothing but the soaked clothes on their backs and whatever supplies they'd managed to salvage. Jackson seemed to reach the same conclusion simultaneously. "I'll check on the horses," he announced abruptly, moving toward the door. "Make sure they're secured for the night." The moment the door closed behind him, Hank gave Ruby a look of gruff understanding. "Nothing improper is happening on my watch, Miss Collins. You can be sure of that." Relief mingled with an unexpected twinge of disappointment that Ruby immediately suppressed. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. I never doubted your discretion." She retrieved the rough wool blanket, its scratchy texture a small price for the modest covering it provided. While Hank busied himself inventorying the remaining supplies, deliberately giving her as much privacy as the single room allowed, Ruby removed her dripping cloak and outer skirt, leaving her in her blouse and petticoats. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, attempting to arrange her hair into some semblance of order without the benefit of comb or mirror. When Jackson returned, his own clothing still dripping, he carried an additional oilskin pack retrieved from his saddlebags. "Camp's at least 5 hours in this weather," he observed. "We'd be foolish to attempt it before morning." The three of them settled into an awkward arrangement around the fire, sharing the meager provisions from the salvaged supplies. Jerky, hard biscuits, and lukewarm coffee brewed in a small pot Hank produced from his coat pocket. "Always carry the essentials," the teamster explained when Ruby expressed surprise. "Man needs his coffee, especially when stranded." The mundane conversation about provisions and weather forecasts carefully skirted the charged undercurrent between Ruby and Jackson. Each time their eyes met across the fire, Ruby felt the echo of that rain-soaked kiss. A memory her body seemed unwilling to relinquish despite her mind's determined efforts. As night deepened, sleep became a practical necessity. Hank, with the trail-hardened adaptability of a longtime teamster, promptly claimed a corner, using his saddle as a pillow. Within minutes, his rhythmic snoring filled the shack, providing oddly comforting evidence of his oblivious presence. Ruby remained by the fire, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, too aware of Jackson seated across from her to consider sleeping. The storm continued unabated, rain drumming against the crude roof while wind occasionally rattled the single shuttered window. "You should rest." Jackson finally broke the silence, his voice low to avoid waking Hank. "Tomorrow will be challenging enough." Ruby nodded without moving, studying the flames rather than meeting his gaze. "What happened at the river?" "Was my fault entirely," he interrupted. "I took advantage of a dangerous situation and your natural relief at survival. Please accept my apologies." The formal contrition in his voice finally made her look up, finding unexpected vulnerability in his expression. "It wasn't entirely one-sided, Mr. Blackwell." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at her return to formality. "Nevertheless, I overstepped bounds I'd promised myself to respect. Why?" The question escaped before Ruby could consider its implications. Jackson studied her across the firelight, weighing his response with evident care. because from the moment I arrived at Silver Creek, I've been drawn to you in ways that complicate my purpose here." He paused, adding softly, "And because near death has a way of stripping away pretense, revealing what truly matters." The raw honesty in his admission created an intimacy more profound than their physical encounter. Ruby found herself at a crossroads: continue with careful deflection or match his candor with her own. "I don't know what to make of you," she admitted finally. "You speak of business partnerships one day and kiss me as if your life depended on it the next. You observe everything with those too perceptive eyes, yet reveal little of your true purpose here. Is that what troubles you, my purpose?" He leaned forward slightly, firelight casting his features into sharp relief. "I told you the truth about evaluating regional operations for the consortium, but I'll admit my stay extended beyond necessity because of you." "Me?" Ruby couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "You're unlike any woman I've encountered, Ruby Collins." The way he said her name carried warmth that seemed to reach across the physical distance between them. "You've created a place for yourself through sheer determination in circumstances that would defeat most people. That kind of courage is compelling." Ruby looked down, uncomfortable with the admiration in his gaze. "Necessity rather than courage, Mr. Blackwell. I had limited options after." She stopped, unwilling to share the humiliation that had preceded her arrival at Silver Creek. "After what?" he prompted gently. The crackling fire and Hank's steady snoring created an illusion of privacy that loosened Ruby's usual reserve. "After my engagement ended in a particularly public and humiliating manner, the man in question decided my figure was too generous for a merchant's wife, and announced his change of heart at our engagement party." Jackson's expression darkened with genuine anger on her behalf. "The man was clearly a fool." "Perhaps," Ruby managed a small smile. "But his rejection led me here, and despite everything, I've found something at Silver Creek I might never have discovered otherwise. Independence, purpose, possibilities I never imagined in Gold Hill." "Including a mining claim?" Jackson asked quietly. Ruby's breath caught, her body tensing involuntarily. "What do you mean?" His expression remained gentle, without accusation. "I've managed mining operations for years, Ruby. I recognize the signs. Your regular herb-gathering excursions, the private conversations with old Pete, the calluses on your hands that come from equipment no cookhouse requires." Fear and indignation warred within Ruby as she struggled to maintain composure. "You've been watching me." "Observing," he corrected. "There's a difference. I haven't interfered or mentioned my suspicions to anyone else." "Well, tell me now." Her mind raced with implications, her claimed security, Pete's involvement, the careful plans they'd constructed. "Because after today, dishonesty between us seems unbearable." Jackson's voice carried no manipulation, only a simple statement of emotional truth. "Your secret remains safe. I admire your initiative, not condemn it." Relief mingled with lingering wariness as Ruby studied him, searching for deception and finding none. "The business partnership you proposed was genuine, though admittedly influenced by what I suspected about your mining activity." Jackson smiled ruefully. "I thought to offer you legitimate backing and protection for ventures you might already be pursuing independently." The revelation shifted Ruby's understanding of their previous interactions, casting his interest in a different light. "You weren't merely being kind to the camp cook. I was drawn to the woman beneath that role. Her intelligence, resilience, and yes, beauty, that has nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with vitality." His voice deepened. "The kiss at the river wasn't calculated, Ruby. It was inevitable." Something fundamental altered in Ruby's perception as she absorbed his words. The man before her wasn't Edwin Porter, measuring her worth against social expectations and finding her wanting. Nor was he a threat to her hard-won independence. He saw her capabilities and respected them, recognized her ambitions and sought to support rather than diminish them. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, vulnerability replacing caution. "This isn't a path I've traveled before." Jackson didn't attempt to close the physical distance between them, respecting the boundaries their shelter circumstances required. "Neither have I, in truth. but I'd like to discover it together if you're willing." The storm raged on outside, but within the crude shelter, Ruby felt an unexpected calm settling over her confusion. Morning would bring practical challenges and a return to Silver Creek's complex dynamics. Her mining claim with Pete still required secrecy, and her growing feelings for Jackson introduced complications she hadn't anticipated. Yet, as she finally allowed herself to stretch out beside the fire, the rough blanket providing modest comfort, Ruby acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted during this storm-swept night. The defenses she'd constructed after Edwin's rejection had protected her from further hurt, but also isolated her from possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. As sleep finally claimed her, Ruby's last waking thought was not of danger survived or secrets revealed, but of rain-soaked lips against hers and the unexpected promise they contained, not of possession but partnership, not of limitations but possibilities as vast as the star-filled sky beyond the storm clouds. Chapter 4. Foundations and Facades. August-September 1870. The junction where Silver Creek Road met the main route to Sacramento had little to recommend it beyond strategic positioning. A dusty crossroads marked by a weather-beaten signpost and a lone oak tree, most travelers passed through without a second glance, intent on more substantial destinations ahead. Yet, as Ruby Collins stood beside old Pete in the late August heat, studying the unremarkable patch of land, she saw not what existed, but what could be. "What do you think?" she asked, shielding her eyes against the sun's glare. "The stage from Sacramento passes this way twice weekly. Freight wagons use this route daily. Even in winter, the road remains passable when higher elevations close." Pete leaned on his walking stick, rheumy eyes assessing the terrain with a prospector's practiced evaluation. Solid ground, good drainage, water source nearby. He nodded slowly. "Location sound. Question is whether you're ready for such a step." Ruby squared her shoulders, the decision already firm in her mind, though she valued Pete's confirmation. "Our claim produces consistently, my savings are substantial, and I can't remain a camp cook forever." She gestured toward the junction. "This is the next logical move." The parcel had come available unexpectedly, 10 acres including the crossroads, offered by a discouraged homesteader returning east after 3 seasons of California disappointment. Ruby had learned of it through Hank during their supply runs, recognizing opportunity where others saw only barren land. 2 days later, she signed the deed with steady hands, converting a portion of her mining proceeds into tangible property. The remaining funds would finance construction of a modest roadhouse, offering meals and basic lodging to travelers. The first step toward the independence she'd been silently building since Edwin Porter's rejection. Word of her purchase spread through Silver Creek with the speed of flash powder, miners speculating about Miss Ruby's big plans with more curiosity than disapproval. When questioned, she offered a simple explanation. Cooking had proven profitable, and a roadhouse at the junction represented natural expansion of her skills. The miners, having benefited from her culinary abilities for months, found the venture logical enough. Only Walter Prescott expressed reservations. "Camp needs a reliable cook," he grumbled when Ruby outlined her transition plan. "Can't have miners going back to burnt beans and leathery biscuits." "I've already arranged for my replacement," Ruby countered, having anticipated his objection. "Mrs. Chen from Sacramento. Her husband works the railroad kitchen. She'll arrive before I depart, and I'll personally train her in camp operations." Prescott harumphed, but offered no further argument, recognizing the determination behind Ruby's careful planning. "Suppose you've earned the right to your ambitions," he finally conceded. "Men'll miss your cooking, though. And your civilizing influence?" The unexpected compliment from the usually taciturn camp manager warmed Ruby more than she'd anticipated. Silver Creek had been her refuge and proving ground. Leaving it stirred more emotion than she'd expected. Construction began in early September, the foundation stones laid by men Ruby hired from neighboring claims, miners seeking supplemental income between their regular shifts. She'd selected a simple but sturdy design, a 2-story structure with a dining room and kitchen below, 4 modest rental rooms above, and quarters for herself and eventually her father at the rear. Nothing fancy, but solid enough to withstand mountain winters and expandable for future growth. Jackson Blackwell's continued presence at Silver Creek might have complicated her plans had he not proven unexpectedly supportive. Following their rain-soaked kiss and subsequent shelter during the storm, their relationship had evolved into something neither had anticipated, a partnership of equals based on mutual respect and growing affection. "The lumber supplier's overcharging you," he noted one evening, reviewing the construction contracts spread across Ruby's kitchen table after the miners had departed. Their heads bent close together over the documents, his presence beside her both distracting and reassuring. "For this quality, you shouldn't pay more than $20 per 1,000 board feet." Ruby frowned, making a notation on her ledger. He quoted 28, claiming transport costs. "Highway robbery," Jackson declared with the confidence of extensive experience. "Mention my name. Say you're considering ordering through Occidental suppliers instead. He'll adjust his figures quickly enough." Such practical advice proved invaluable as Ruby navigated the unfamiliar terrain of property development. Jackson's business acumen complemented her practical management skills, their collaboration extending naturally from professional to personal realms. They maintained public discretion, conscious of Ruby's position as the sole woman at camp, but private moments accumulated like gold dust in a prospector's pan, his hand lingering against hers while passing documents, shared laughter over contractors' outlandish estimates, quiet conversations beneath star-filled skies after the camp settled for the night. "You're building something remarkable," Jackson told her one such evening as they stood at the partially constructed roadhouse, timber framing silhouetted against the sunset. His fingers intertwined with hers, hidden from any curious observers by gathering dusk. "Most people talk about dreams. You transform them into reality through sheer determination." Ruby allowed herself to lean slightly against his solid presence, still marveling at how natural such contact had become despite her previous wariness. "I had little choice after Gold Hill. Determination was my only currency." "That's not entirely true." Jackson's voice carried the gentle teasing that had become familiar between them. "You also had exceptional biscuits. Never underestimate the power of proper baking in securing one's future." Her laughter, a sound once rare but increasingly frequent in his company, drifted across the construction site. "Is that what attracted you, Mr. Blackwell? My culinary skills?" "Among other qualities," he murmured, his tone shifting as he turned to face her directly. In the fading light, his blue eyes held an intensity that still caused her breath to catch. "Your courage, intelligence, refusal to accept limitations others would impose." Such moments left Ruby both thrilled and cautious, the memory of Edwin's rejection a fading but persistent shadow. Jackson Blackwell represented complications she hadn't anticipated in her carefully constructed plans. Emotional entanglements that threatened her hard-won independence even as they offered companionship she'd never truly experienced before. Yet as September progressed and her roadhouse took shape, Ruby found herself increasingly welcoming his presence in her life. Their partnership in developing the roadhouse felt fundamentally different from Edwin's conditional acceptance. Jackson valued her opinions, respected her decisions, and offered advice without imposing control. "Have you considered a broader porch across the front?" he suggested as they reviewed the evolving structure one crisp morning. "Travelers appreciate somewhere to sit after a dusty journey, especially with the view of the foothills from this vantage." Ruby studied the building's facade, envisioning his suggestion. The additional lumber would increase costs, but potentially increase patrons' length of stay. Jackson sketched the proposed modification on the building plans she carried. A comfortable guest spends more on food and drink while resting. The investment would likely return itself within months. Such exchanges, practical, collaborative, respectful, reformed the foundation of their evolving relationship. The stolen moments that accompanied them, a brushed hand, a shared smile, occasionally a quick kiss when certain of privacy, added layers of personal connection that both exhilarated and frightened Ruby with their intensity. By late September, with the roadhouse's exterior nearing completion and interior work beginning, Ruby faced her next significant challenge: returning to Gold Hill to invite her father to join her new enterprise. The prospect of walking those streets again, confronting memories of public humiliation, tested her newfound confidence in ways building a business from scratch had not. Would you like company?" Jackson offered the evening before her planned departure. They stood in the shadow of the supply shed, a moment of privacy stolen between her kitchen duties and his meeting with Prescott. Ruby shook her head, though touched by the offer. "This journey I need to make alone. Gold Hill represents a chapter I must close properly before beginning the next." His understanding nod, free from wounded pride or protective insistence, confirmed yet again how fundamentally different he was from Edwin Porter. "Then I wish you clear skies and steady resolve, though the latter you possess in abundance already." His kiss, brief but tender, carried encouragement rather than possession. As Ruby prepared for her journey the following morning, she drew strength from that distinction, ready to face her past with the confidence her accomplishments had earned. Gold Hill hadn't changed in the months since Ruby's departure. The same dusty main street stretched between false-fronted buildings. The same church bell marked the hours. The same groups of women gathered outside the general store, heads bent in conversation that paused when the Sacramento stage deposited Ruby before the hotel. What had changed, Ruby realized as she descended the coach steps, was herself. She wore a new dress, purchased with her mining proceeds, deep blue merino wool with subtle trim, neither ostentatious nor overly plain. Her chestnut hair was arranged simply but fashionably beneath a modest hat. But the true transformation lay beneath these external improvements, in her straightened spine, steady gaze, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had built something with her own hands and determination. Ruby felt the stares as she collected her small valise from the driver, noted the whispers behind gloved hands as former acquaintances recognized her. 6 months earlier, such attention would have mortified her, reopening wounds of public rejection. Now she acknowledged the curious onlookers with calm nods, neither seeking their approval nor fearing their judgment. "Ruby Collins? Is that really you?" Margaret Wilson hurried from her millinery shop, genuine pleasure illuminating her kind face. The widow had been Ruby's only consistent supporter following Edwin's humiliation. "It's wonderful to see you, Mrs. Wilson." Ruby accepted the older woman's embrace, her composure warming with authentic affection. "You're looking well." "And you." Margaret stepped back, appraising Ruby with undisguised amazement. "You're positively glowing, child. The mountain air must agree with you. Or perhaps there's another reason for such radiance." Her eyebrows rose suggestively. Ruby laughed, surprising herself with the ease of the sound. "The satisfaction of hard work and new opportunities, nothing more scandalous. Is my father at your place still?" "Indeed he is, though he'll be at the Palmer place until evening, helping repair their barn roof despite my insistence his leg needs rest." Margaret tucked Ruby's arm through hers, guiding her along the boardwalk. "He'll be overjoyed at your return. Reads your letters aloud so often I've memorized descriptions of your roadhouse construction." They strolled toward the millinery shop, Margaret updating Ruby on local developments, births, marriages, business changes. With the thoroughness of a small-town newspaper, Ruby listened with polite interest, noting how distant these once central concerns now seemed compared to lumber prices and stage schedules. "Porter's Mercantile has struggled these past months," Margaret mentioned, with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Edwin overextended his credit on a shipment of Eastern goods that proved unsuitable for local tastes. Sarah Porter blames everyone but her precious son, of course." Ruby was mildly surprised to find the information stirred no particular emotion, neither vindication nor lingering hurt. "I'm sorry to hear of anyone's business difficulties," she replied with genuine neutrality. Margaret's sideways glance held both surprise and approval at Ruby's response. "You've changed, my dear, and entirely for the better." As if conjured by their conversation, the door to Porter's Mercantile swung open directly ahead, and Edwin himself emerged. He paused on the threshold, account book in hand, preoccupied with its contents until proximity forced him to look up. Recognition transformed his features with almost comical speed. Disbelief, confusion, and finally painful awareness as he fully registered Ruby's presence. His gaze traveled from her fashionable attire to her composed expression, finding neither the shabbiness nor the humiliation he perhaps expected. "Miss Collins," he managed, his voice higher than she remembered. "What an unexpected pleasure. You're looking quite well, Mr. Porter." Ruby acknowledged him with the same polite detachment she might offer any casual acquaintance. "I trust business finds you prosperous?" Color rose in Edwin's thin face at her pointed inquiry. "Well enough, certainly. Temporary adjustments to inventory, nothing significant." He shifted awkwardly, clearly struggling between pride and unexpected interest in her transformed appearance. "I'd heard rumors of your establishment in the mountains. Quite enterprising of you." "The roadhouse nears completion," Ruby confirmed, offering no further details to his evident curiosity. "If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Wilson and I have matters to discuss." She made to continue past him, but Edwin stepped slightly into her path, not blocking exactly, but deliberately extending their interaction. "Perhaps, Miss Collins, when you have time, we might discuss your return to Gold Hill. I've often reflected on our misunderstanding with regret." The words that once would have dominated her thoughts, perhaps even rekindled painful hope, now struck Ruby as merely sad. The man before her seemed diminished somehow, his shoulders slightly stooped, his formerly immaculate attire showing subtle signs of wear, his expression holding a desperation she'd never noticed during their courtship. "I'm not returning to Gold Hill, Mr. Porter," she corrected gently, finding forgiveness easier from the vantage point of her new life. "I'm merely visiting my father before he joins me at Silver Creek Junction, but I wish you well in your endeavors." She moved past him with Margaret still at her side, feeling his stare follow their progress down the boardwalk. The encounter had lasted barely a minute, yet represented a closing of chapters far more effectively than any lengthy confrontation. "Well handled," Margaret murmured as they turned the corner toward her shop. "Sarah Porter is watching from the window, likely seething at your obvious success." Ruby smiled, genuinely unconcerned with Sarah Porter's opinions. Strange how people who once loomed so large in our minds can shrink to proper proportion when viewed from the right distance. As they approached the millinery, Ruby reflected on the sweet taste of this moment. Not bitter triumph over those who had rejected her, but simple indifference. The ache that had driven her from Gold Hill had transformed into appreciation for the path it had forced her to discover. Edwin Porter had deemed her unsuitable as a merchant's wife, never imagining she would build a business of her own. Gold Hill society had closed its doors to her, never suspecting she would create a new establishment where she made the rules. Their rejection, intended to diminish her, had instead revealed possibilities beyond the narrow confines of their expectations. Ruby Collins had left Gold Hill in humiliation 6 months earlier. She walked its streets now not seeking redemption or revenge, but simply as a woman who had outgrown the limitations others had tried to impose. A woman building foundations while others maintained facades. Golden October light slanted through the uncurtained windows of Ruby's roadhouse, transforming the newly installed pine floorboards into gleaming honey beneath her feet. The scents of fresh-cut wood, paint, and lingering sawdust filled the large main room that would soon welcome travelers seeking rest and sustenance at the crossroads. Ruby stood in the center, making mental notes of final tasks before the grand opening scheduled for week's end. Her father had returned with her from Gold Hill, his initial skepticism about her venture giving way to gruff pride as he witnessed the tangible results of her months of planning. Daniel Collins now supervised the installation of the kitchen equipment, his practical mining experience transferring surprisingly well to assessing the soundness of stoves and work counters. "Last delivery's here," Jackson's voice preceded him through the front door as he maneuvered backward, guiding 2 workers carrying a massive oak bar that would serve as the dining room's focal point. "Where would you like it, Miss Proprietress?" Ruby pointed to the far wall where support beams had been reinforced to handle the substantial weight. "Centered between those 2 windows, please." She watched as Jackson directed the installation with the easy authority that seemed as natural to him as breathing. In the week since her return from Gold Hill, their relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm. His extended stay at Silver Creek providing ample opportunity for him to assist with the roadhouse completion, while maintaining the professional pretense that kept gossip to a minimum. The workers departed as dusk approached, Jackson pressing coins into their palms with thanks for their careful handling of the bar. Daniel announced his intention to check on the stable construction behind the main building, leaving Ruby and Jackson unexpectedly alone in the empty roadhouse as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. Ruby ran her fingers along the polished oak surface, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's perfect, better than I envisioned. As is everything about this place." Jackson stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his tall frame. "You've created something remarkable, Ruby." The pride in his voice matched what she felt in her own heart, satisfaction in seeing determination transformed into physical reality. The roadhouse represented everything she'd built since Edwin's rejection: independence, security, and the freedom to define herself by her own standards, rather than society's narrow expectations. She acknowledged, turning to find his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that still caused her breath to catch, despite months of acquaintance. "Nonsense. You'd have found your way, perhaps with more costly mistakes, but your persistence would have prevailed." Jackson's smile softened his features in the golden light. "I merely smoothed the path occasionally." Ruby gestured toward the empty room around them. "It's strange to see it completed after imagining it for so long. In a week, these spaces will be filled with travelers and conversation." "And tonight?" Jackson asked, his voice lowering slightly as he stepped closer. "Tonight it belongs only to us. The first moment of quiet before your creation comes fully to life." Without warning, he extended his hand in a formal gesture that momentarily confused her. "Would you honor me with a dance, Miss Collins?" Ruby glanced around the empty room, a surprised laugh escaping her. "There's no music." "Isn't there?" Jackson's expression grew playful. "Listen closely. The wind in the eaves, the settling of new timbers, the distant creek flowing over stones. The building's first symphony, composed exclusively for its creator." The whimsy of his suggestion charmed her, breaking through the practical concerns that usually occupied her thoughts. Ruby placed her hand in his, allowing him to draw her into proper dance position, his right hand at her waist, her left resting lightly on his shoulder, their other hands clasped at shoulder height. "I'm afraid I'm out of practice," she admitted as he began to lead her in a simple waltz pattern across the empty floor. "Mining camps offer few opportunities for formal dancing." "You move perfectly," Jackson assured her, guiding her through a gentle turn that sent her skirts swirling around their ankles. For a man of his size, he possessed remarkable grace, his steps confident without being forceful. They moved together in the fading light, finding unexpected harmony in the silent dance. Ruby gradually relaxed into his lead, the rhythmic pattern of their steps creating an intimacy that transcended physical proximity. This moment, so far removed from her practical concerns of ledgers and supply orders, felt like a glimpse of another life, one where beauty and connection held equal importance to achievement and security. "Tell me what you want, Ruby," Jackson murmured near her ear as they swayed together in the center of the room. The low timbre of his voice sent a pleasant shiver along her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, though something in his tone suggested layers to the question beyond its simple phrasing. "In life. In business." His steps slowed until they were barely moving, more embracing than dancing. His voice dropped lower, his breath warm against her temple. "In a man." The directness of his question startled her, though perhaps it shouldn't have after months of gradually deepening connection. They had been circling this moment since the rain-soaked kiss by the flooding river, each interaction building toward an inevitability neither had fully acknowledged until now. "I want honesty," Ruby answered, finding truth easier in the gathering darkness that hid her flushing cheeks. "Independence without isolation. Partnership without possession." Jackson's hand at her waist drew her slightly closer, their dance entirely forgotten, though they remained in its formal embrace. "And passion? Does that factor into your considerations, Ruby Collins?" The question hung between them, charged with months of restrained attraction. Without waiting for her verbal response, Jackson lowered his head, claiming her lips with a gentle insistence that quickly deepened as Ruby responded. Unlike their first desperate kiss during the storm, this carried deliberate intent, exploration rather than sudden release. Ruby's hands moved to his shoulders, steadying herself as the intensity between them built with startling swiftness. Jackson guided her backward until she felt the solid wall behind her, his body pressing against hers with unmistakable desire while his lips traveled from her mouth to the sensitive spot beneath her ear. "I've imagined this for months," he confessed against her skin, his voice rough with emotion. "Your taste, your touch, the sound of your breath catching when I kiss you here." His lips found the pulse point at her throat, drawing a soft gasp from Ruby that confirmed his observation. His hands remained respectfully at her waist and shoulder, but the restraint clearly cost him effort as his breathing quickened. When his mouth returned to hers, the kiss carried hunger that matched the growing ache spreading through Ruby's body, a sensation both frightening and exhilarating in its intensity. "I want all of you, Ruby," he whispered against her lips, the simple declaration carrying profound meaning beyond its surface. Not just stolen moments between business discussions, not hurried embraces before propriety intervenes. Everything you are, everything we could be together. The raw honesty in his voice penetrated the haze of physical response, confronting Ruby with a decision she hadn't anticipated facing so directly. Despite the desire coursing through her, caution reasserted itself. Awareness of how completely such surrender might transform the independence she'd fought to establish. "I'm not ready," she admitted, breathless, her hands gently creating space between them. "Not yet. This roadhouse, my business. I need to know I've truly secured my own foundation before—" She trailed off, struggling to articulate fears that seemed simultaneously reasonable and foolish in the face of the connection they'd built. Jackson stepped back immediately, though it visibly cost him effort to do so. In the near darkness, she could see him working to master his breathing, his obvious physical response to their embrace making his restraint all the more meaningful. "I understand," he said finally, no resentment in his voice despite the frustration evident in his stance. "You've fought too hard for your independence to risk it without certainty." Ruby reached out, touching his face with gentle fingers. "It's not rejection, Jackson. It's wisdom," he finished for her, turning to press a kiss against her palm. "You need to establish this place as yours alone before considering what we might build together." "I respect that, Ruby. Truly." He drew a steadying breath, his smile returning, though tempered with wry acknowledgement of their mutual state. "I'll wait," he promised simply. "You're worth waiting for. Worth doing this properly with no regrets or uncertainties between us." The respect in his eyes, despite his obvious disappointment, confirmed what Ruby had begun to recognize. Jackson Blackwell was fundamentally different from any man she'd known. He understood her need for independence not as feminine caprice, but as essential foundation for anything meaningful they might build together. "Thank you," she whispered, the inadequate words carrying deeper gratitude than their simplicity conveyed. As if sensing the intensity needed lightening, Jackson stepped back, offering an exaggerated formal bow that made Ruby smile despite her still flushed cheeks. "However, Miss Collins, I hope our business partnership remains unaffected by these personal considerations. The Roadhouse success remains my primary professional interest." The deliberate return to their public personas helped restore equilibrium, though the memory of his body pressed against hers lingered like physical imprint. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell, your business acumen remains invaluable regardless of other considerations." The teasing formality dissolved the last tension between them, allowing them to move forward from the intimate moment without awkwardness or regret. As they lit lamps to continue evening preparations for the opening, Ruby found herself studying Jackson with new awareness, not just of his physical appeal, but of the patience and respect that made him truly exceptional. Whatever foundation she was building, she realized, Jackson Blackwell had already become an essential element of its structure. Ruby's Roadhouse officially opened on a crisp October morning, its freshly painted signs swinging in the autumn breeze as the first stagecoach from Sacramento pulled into the yard. Smoke curled invitingly from the kitchen chimney, carrying the aroma of fresh bread and brewing coffee across the crossroads. Inside, Ruby surveyed final preparations with barely controlled excitement, mingled with nervous anticipation. The main room gleamed with polish and care, sturdy tables arranged to maximize both capacity and comfort, curtains framing windows that offered views of distant foothills, the massive oak bar now stocked with coffee urns and pie safes rather than whiskey bottles. "Stop fussing, girl. Place looks fine as any establishment I've seen," Daniel Collins declared, adjusting his newly purchased vest with evident pride in his position as doorman and unofficial greeter. The role suited him perfectly, his gift for conversation and storytelling making him an immediate favorite with travelers while keeping him off his damaged leg for extended periods. "It needs to be more than fine, Pa. First impressions determine whether travelers return or merely pass through." Ruby adjusted a slightly crooked painting, a watercolor of Silver Creek's mountain views that old Pete had surprised her with as an opening gift. The crunch of wagon wheels on gravel announced the stage's arrival. Daniel straightened his posture and moved to his position by the door, ready to welcome the Roadhouse's first official customers. "Showtime, Ruby girl. Let's show these travelers what Collins hospitality means." The day unfolded in a whirlwind of activity that left Ruby little time for reflection. Stagecoach passengers gratefully devoured hot breakfasts before continuing their journeys. Freight wagon drivers lingered over coffee, exchanging news from distant settlements. By midday, word had spread along the routes that the new establishment offered exceptional food and clean accommodations at fair prices. To Ruby's surprise and pleasure, a contingent of Silver Creek miners arrived in mid-afternoon, having traveled specifically to support her opening day. Bronson, Murphy, and a half-dozen others crowded around the largest table, ordering generous portions and complimenting each dish with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Almost makes me miss camp cookin'," Bronson declared, with a wink as he sampled Ruby's venison stew. "Though can't say I miss old Joe's return. Man boiled coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe." "Mrs. Chen's cooking has improved significantly with practice," Ruby assured him, warmth spreading through her chest at their loyalty in making the journey. "Though I suspect you exaggerate my skills for kindness' sake." "Miss Ruby," Murphy spoke up, uncharacteristically bold for the usually shy miner. "There's no exaggeration needed. You brought civilization to Silver Creek. Now you're bringing it to this crossroads." Throughout the day, Ruby caught glimpses of Jackson moving throughout the establishment, conversing easily with travelers and occasionally directing their attention to various amenities the Roadhouse offered. Though he'd officially returned to Sacramento weeks earlier, he'd arranged to be present for the opening, arriving that morning with the first stagecoach. True to his word, he maintained respectful distance publicly, allowing Ruby to command her domain without interference or implied partnership. His support remained subtle, steering conversation toward regional development when freight company owners were present, casually mentioning the Roadhouse's strategic location to business travelers, endorsing the quality of accommodations to those considering overnight stays. By dusk, when the last daytime customers departed and only overnight guests remained settled in their upstairs rooms, Ruby finally allowed herself to sink into a chair, feet aching but satisfaction radiating through her exhaustion. The day's receipts far exceeded her projections, with all 4 rooms rented and advance bookings noted for regular stage passengers. "You've done it, Ruby girl," Daniel said, lowering himself carefully into the chair beside her. "Your mother would burst with pride if she could see what you've built." Emotion thickened his voice as he surveyed the now quiet room. "I know I do." Ruby squeezed his weathered hand, too moved for words. After all the months of planning, saving, and building, the Roadhouse had transformed from dream to reality, a tangible achievement that even Gold Hill's social arbiters couldn't diminish or deny. After her father retired to their living quarters behind the kitchen, Ruby remained to complete final preparations for morning service. She was arranging coffee beans for early brewing when the main door opened quietly, admitting Jackson despite the closed sign she'd hung. "Successful beyond even your careful projections, I'd say," he observed, moving to help her with the heavy sack of beans. "You've hardly had a moment to acknowledge your triumph," Ruby smiled, fatigue momentarily forgotten as she registered his presence. Throughout the hectic day, she'd been aware of him peripherally, appreciating his deliberate restraint while managing her new enterprise. "The real test will be repeat business, but yes." A promising beginning. I have something for you. Jackson reached into his coat pocket, producing a small velvet pouch. A commemoration of your achievement. Ruby opened the drawstring, tipping the contents into her palm. A small gold brooch gleamed in the lamplight, expertly crafted in the shape of a cooking pot with a hinged lid that opened to reveal a tiny compartment within. To commemorate where you started, Jackson explained with a smile that held both teasing and genuine sentiment. From camp cook to proprietress, a remarkable journey in just 6 months. The thoughtfulness of the gift, acknowledging her humble beginnings rather than attempting to erase them, touched Ruby deeply. The brooch represented not just her current success, but the path that had led to it, including the rejection that had forced her to discover her own strength. It's perfect, she whispered, looking up to find him watching her with that same intensity that always seemed to see beyond her carefully maintained composure. Thank you for understanding what this means to me. The entire journey, not just its destination. Ruby rose on tiptoe to place a kiss of gratitude on his cheek, but as their eyes met, the simple gesture transformed into something deeper. His arms encircled her waist as her hands found his shoulders, the kiss deepening with emotions too complex for words. Pride, desire, mutual respect, and growing affection that terrified and exhilarated her simultaneously. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers, his voice low and rough with feeling. I am so proud of what you've accomplished, Ruby Collins. Not because I had any part in it, but because you've claimed your own worth so thoroughly that no one will ever make you doubt it again. The perceptiveness of his observation, recognizing that her success represented healing as much as achievement, confirmed what Ruby had begun to accept. Jackson Blackwell understood her in ways Edwin Porter never had, saw her capability as an asset rather than an inconvenience, and respected her need for independence as strength rather than feminine willfulness. The roadhouse is established now, she said quietly, the implication of her words clear between them. My foundation is secure. Jackson's eyes darkened with understanding, but he merely brushed his lips against her forehead in gentle restraint. And I meant what I said about waiting until you're certain. This isn't a negotiation or a transaction, Ruby. If you decide you want more between us, it will be because both of us are ready for a true partnership. The word partnership carried weight beyond business arrangements, suggesting something Ruby had never truly considered possible. A joining of equals rather than the subordination marriage typically represented for women. The concept both frightened and attracted her, like standing at the edge of an unexplored territory that promised both danger and treasure. You should rest, Jackson said, stepping back with obvious reluctance. Tomorrow brings another day of establishing your reputation along this route. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. I'll return to Sacramento on the morning stage. The consortium expects reports on regional development, and I've delayed them too long already. Ruby felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his departure. Despite her determination to build her business independently, his presence had become a comfortable constant over recent months. Will you return soon? The question escaped before she could consider its implications. Jackson's smile suggested he recognized the significance of her asking. Within a fortnight, he promised. Sooner, if business allows. The consortium has significant interest in this region's development, particularly now that a respectable establishment anchors the crossroads. The practical framing of his return eased Ruby's self-consciousness about appearing too eager for his company. They had both become adept at balancing the personal and professional aspects of their connection, maintaining proper appearances while acknowledging the deeper currents between them. Travel safely, she said simply, pinning the gold brooch to her collar with fingers that betrayed a slight tremor. After Jackson departed, Ruby moved through the quiet roadhouse, extinguishing lamps and securing doors. The building settled around her with the subtle creaks and sighs of new construction finding its permanent shape. So, much like her own life, she reflected, a structure built carefully from the raw materials of disappointment and determination, now standing solid at the crossroads of who she had been and who she was becoming. As she finally retired to her quarters, the gold brooch caught lamplight from her bedside table. From camp cook to proprietress, a journey marked by hard work and painful growth. And perhaps now, Ruby acknowledged as sleep claimed her, she was finally ready to consider what paths might still lie ahead, including those that could be traveled with a partner rather than alone. Jackson's eyes darkened with understanding, but he merely brushed his lips against her forehead in gentle restraint. "And I meant what I said about waiting until you're certain. This isn't a negotiation or a transaction, Ruby. If you decide you want more between us, it will be because both of us are ready for a true partnership." The word partnership carried weight beyond business arrangements, suggesting something Ruby had never truly considered possible. A joining of equals rather than the subordination marriage typically represented for women. The concept both frightened and attracted her, like standing at the edge of an unexplored territory that promised both danger and treasure. "You should rest," Jackson said, stepping back with obvious reluctance. "Tomorrow brings another day of establishing your reputation along this route." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I'll return to Sacramento on the morning stage. The consortium expects reports on regional development, and I've delayed them too long already." Ruby felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his departure. Despite her determination to build her business independently, his presence had become a comfortable constant over recent months. "Will you return soon?" The question escaped before she could consider its implications. Jackson's smile suggested he recognized the significance of her asking. "Within a fortnight," he promised. "Sooner, if business allows. The consortium has significant interest in this region's development, particularly now that a respectable establishment anchors the crossroads." The practical framing of his return eased Ruby's self-consciousness about appearing too eager for his company. They had both become adept at balancing the personal and professional aspects of their connection, maintaining proper appearances while acknowledging the deeper currents between them. "Travel safely," she said simply, pinning the gold brooch to her collar with fingers that betrayed a slight tremor. After Jackson departed, Ruby moved through the quiet roadhouse, extinguishing lamps and securing doors. The building settled around her with the subtle creaks and sighs of new construction finding its permanent shape. So much like her own life, she reflected, a structure built carefully from the raw materials of disappointment and determination, now standing solid at the crossroads of who she had been and who she was becoming. As she finally retired to her quarters, the gold brooch caught lamplight from her bedside table. From camp cook to proprietress, a journey marked by hard work and painful growth. And perhaps now, Ruby acknowledged as sleep claimed her, she was finally ready to consider what paths might still lie ahead, including those that could be traveled with a partner rather than alone. Late October brought steady business to Ruby's Roadhouse, each passing day confirming the wisdom of her investment. Stagecoach passengers spread word of the establishment's clean rooms and excellent meals, while freight haulers made it a regular stop on their Sacramento routes. Ruby worked from dawn until well past dusk, the exhaustion in her muscles at day's end serving as physical confirmation of her growing success. Jackson had returned from Sacramento as promised, his 2-week absence somehow feeling longer than the months they'd spent in daily proximity at Silver Creek. Though he maintained rooms in Auburn, he frequently dined at the Roadhouse, offering business advice that proved consistently valuable while respecting the boundaries Ruby had established. The evening brought a welcome lull after the dinner rush, most travelers either continuing their journeys or retiring to their rooms upstairs. Ruby wiped down tables and straightened chairs, savoring the quiet satisfaction of another profitable day. Her father had already retired, his leg troubling him after a busy afternoon greeting customers. A sound from her small office behind the kitchen caught Ruby's attention, the soft scrape of a chair against floorboards when no one should have been there. Moving quietly across the main room, she pushed open the partially closed door to find Jackson seated at her desk, hastily closing her business ledger as she entered. "Ruby!" He stood quickly, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I was just looking for that freight company information we discussed. Thought it might be in your accounts book." The explanation seemed reasonable enough on its surface. They had indeed been discussing potential shipping arrangements that morning, and Ruby had mentioned recording contact information in her ledger. Yet something in his startled reaction, a flicker of what might have been guilt before his composed expression returned, stirred an unease she couldn't immediately dismiss. "Of course," she replied, maintaining outward calm while noting the unusual tension in his posture. "Though you might have asked before examining my private business records." "You're absolutely right." Jackson moved away from the desk with casual deliberateness. "A thoughtless liberty. I apologize." Ruby studied him, troubled by the sense that his usual forthright manner had been replaced by something more calculated. "Did you find what you needed?" "Not yet, but it's not urgent." He gestured toward the main room. "You've had a busy day. Perhaps a moment on the porch before I return to Auburn? The evening's particularly fine." The subtle redirection wasn't lost on Ruby, but she nodded agreement, telling herself she was overreacting to an innocent if presumptuous action. They settled on the wide porch that had proven one of the roadhouse's most appealing features, watching distant stars emerge in the deepening dusk. Their conversation returned to safe topics: business projections, upcoming holiday travel that might increase patronage, improvements Ruby planned for the spring. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of their exchange ran an undercurrent of something altered, as though a previously transparent glass had developed a slight clouding. The incident might have faded from significance had Ruby not witnessed another troubling scene 3 days later. She had gone to the stables behind the roadhouse to discuss feed deliveries with the young man she'd hired to manage the horses. Approaching the corner of the building, she heard Jackson's voice. The usual warmth replaced by a clipped formality that immediately captured her attention. "The timeline has shifted. These matters require delicate handling." Jackson's tone carried tension Ruby had never heard before. "The syndicate grows impatient." The responding voice belonged to a stranger, cultured, authoritative, and distinctly displeased. "We have investors expecting definitive action before year's end. Your reports have been frustratingly vague regarding acquisition opportunities." Ruby stepped deliberately on a dry twig, unwilling to eavesdrop further, but equally unwilling to pretend she hadn't overheard. Both men turned sharply at the sound, revealing Jackson standing with a well-dressed gentleman whose expensive coat and gold watch chain marked him as someone of significant means. "Ah, Miss Collins," Jackson recovered smoothly. "Perfect timing. May I introduce Mr. Harrington from Sacramento? He's interested in our regional transportation improvements." The stranger offered a stiff bow, his assessment of Ruby barely concealing disdain at her practical work attire and unadorned appearance. "Charmed, I'm sure. We were just concluding our business." "Indeed we were." Jackson's expression remained pleasant, though Ruby detected strain around his eyes. Mr. Harrington was about to depart. After the briefest exchange of pleasantries, the stranger mounted an impressively groomed bay horse and departed down the Sacramento road, his posture as rigid as his manner had been. Ruby turned to Jackson, determined to address what she'd overheard. "Transportation improvements seem an unlikely topic to discuss behind stables rather than in my establishment's comfortable dining room," she observed, keeping her voice level despite the unease churning beneath her calm exterior. Jackson hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his features, before he answered. "Harrington represents potential suppliers for regional developments. Supply contracts, primarily. Nothing that would interest you directly." "And this syndicate he mentioned, the one growing impatient?" Ruby pressed, unwilling to accept such an obviously incomplete explanation. "Business consortium terminology. Investors always want faster results than realistic timelines allow." Jackson reached for her hand, his smile returning with apparent sincerity. "Dull commercial matters, Ruby. Nothing worth your concern when your roadhouse flourishes so impressively under your management." The deliberate compliment and subtle redirection only heightened Ruby's suspicion. Jackson had never before dismissed her interest in business matters or suggested certain topics exceeded her understanding. The patronizing note, however slight, struck a discordant chord in their usually equal exchanges. That night, after the roadhouse quieted and her father's gentle snores drifted from his room, Ruby lit a lamp and methodically examined her business records and the small safe where she kept both roadhouse profits and her personal mining proceeds. Nothing appeared amiss. Ledgers balanced, funds secured, property deeds properly filed, yet certainty eluded her, questions multiplying rather than resolving with each document she reviewed. Jackson's interest in her roadhouse had always seemed genuine, his advice consistently beneficial. But what if that interest served ulterior motives she hadn't recognized? What if his business consortium, this syndicate, had designs on the developing crossroads that conflicted with her own establishment's future? When old Pete arrived the following morning with fresh ore samples from their claim, Ruby shared her concerns during a private moment behind the kitchen garden. The elderly miner listened without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly grave as she described both incidents. "Can't say I'm surprised," he finally responded, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Been wondering when his true purpose might surface." "You suspected something?" Ruby asked, both relieved and dismayed to have her unease validated. Pete shrugged, his roomy eyes reflecting hard-earned wisdom. "Man like that doesn't extend his stay at a mining camp for months without powerful reasons. Occidental Mining Consortium doesn't send representatives to backwater operations without specific intent." He patted Ruby's hand with gnarled fingers. "Been trying to warn you gently. Men like Jackson Blackwell have agendas bigger than romance, no matter how genuine the feelings might grow alongside them." "You think his interest in me was calculated from the beginning?" The possibility sent a cold tendril of hurt through Ruby's chest, despite her determination to remain pragmatic. "Maybe, maybe not. Feelings can grow genuine even when they sprout from calculated soil." Pete's expression softened with sympathy. "Question is whether his loyalty ultimately lies with you or with whatever interest sent him here initially." The uncertainty plagued Ruby throughout the following days. Jackson continued his regular visits to the roadhouse, his manner as attentive and supportive as ever. No further suspicious incidents occurred to confirm her doubts, yet neither could she fully dismiss them, especially with Pete's warning echoing in her thoughts. She found herself watching Jackson with new awareness, searching for inconsistencies or hints of deception in his words and actions. The vigilance exhausted her almost as much as running the roadhouse, creating a barrier between them that he clearly sensed but couldn't identify the cause of, his increasingly questioning glances meeting her carefully neutral responses. The emotional distance grew alongside her success, prosperity, and suspicion developing in parallel tracks that left Ruby increasingly isolated despite the constant human interaction her business provided. By early November, the strain had become a tangible presence between them, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. November arrived with the first significant storm of the season, dark clouds gathering throughout the afternoon before releasing a deluge that drove travelers to seek shelter at the roadhouse. By evening, all 4 guest rooms were occupied, the dining room had served its largest dinner crowd since opening, and Ruby had added extra bedrolls in the stable loft for freighters unwilling to continue in the worsening conditions. As she secured the main door after the last customer retired upstairs, thunder rumbled ominously overhead. Rain lashing against windows with an intensity that made Ruby grateful for the solid construction Jackson had insisted upon. The thought of him brought the familiar conflict of emotions. Gratitude for his practical advice, warring with lingering suspicion about his ultimate motives. She had just settled before the parlor fireplace with a cup of tea when an urgent knocking penetrated the storm's percussion. Frowning at the late hour, Ruby checked that her father hadn't been awakened before unlocking the main door, pulling it open against wind that threatened to tear it from her grasp. Jackson Blackwell stood on her porch, rain streaming from his hat brim and shoulders despite the protection of an oilskin coat. Even in the dim lamplight, Ruby could see unusual intensity in his expression, determination mingled with something that might have been nervous resolution. "Jackson, what on earth? I need to speak with you." He removed his hat, rainwater immediately plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "It can't wait until morning." Ruby hesitated only briefly before stepping aside, concern overriding her recent wariness. "Come in before you drown. There's fire in the parlor." He followed her to the small, private sitting room adjoining the main dining area, declining her offer to take his coat. Water pooled around his boots on the polished floor, but he seemed oblivious to both his sodden state and the late hour, standing rigidly before the fireplace with hands clasped behind his back. "You've been distant these past weeks," he began without preamble. "At first I thought it merely the demands of your business, but there's more to it. You're watching me with doubt, Ruby. I need to understand why." The directness of his approach momentarily disarmed her. Ruby set down her teacup, gathering her thoughts before responding. "I overheard your conversation with Mr. Harrington about the syndicate growing impatient. It didn't align with your explanation about supply contracts." Jackson's expression tightened, but he nodded, as though her answer confirmed a suspicion. "I should have been more forthcoming. You deserve complete honesty." He drew a deep breath. "My original assignment at Silver Creek was indeed to evaluate regional operations, but with a specific purpose, identifying acquisition targets and development opportunities for the consortium." The confirmation of Pete's warning sent a cold wash of disappointment through Ruby, despite her preparedness for exactly this revelation. "So, your interest in my roadhouse, in me, was part of that assignment?" "Initially, yes," Jackson admitted, his blunt honesty surprising her. "The Crossroads location has strategic value for regional development. When you purchased the property, you became relevant to consortium interests." Ruby stood, anger displacing hurt as the implications clarified. "You cultivated my trust to gain information about my business, to determine whether I could be persuaded to sell or partner with your syndicate." "That was the original intent," Jackson agreed, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "But something happened that neither I nor the consortium anticipated." "And what was that?" Ruby asked coolly, struggling to maintain composure despite the painful realization that her suspicions had been justified. Jackson stepped forward, water still dripping from his coat as he reached for her hands. "I fell in love with you, Ruby Collins. Completely, irrevocably, beyond any business consideration or professional obligation." The simple declaration hung between them, punctuated by thunder that rattled the roadhouse windows. Ruby stared at him, searching for deception and finding only raw sincerity in his rain-spattered face. "The consortium still expects me to secure this location," he continued before she could respond. "Harrington was pressing for progress reports, for a plan to acquire your property or at minimum negotiate developmental rights." "And what have you told them?" Ruby asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Nothing useful. Vague assurances. Delaying tactics." A rueful smile crossed his features. "My reports have grown increasingly incoherent to my employers, I suspect, because my priorities shifted entirely once I recognized what you've come to mean to me." Before Ruby could process this admission, Jackson released her hands and lowered himself to one knee on her parlor floor, water from his coat soaking into the carpet as he reached into his pocket. "I came here tonight to resolve the conflict between my past obligations and my present certainties." He produced a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring containing an emerald of startling size and clarity surrounded by smaller diamonds. "I've resigned my position with Occidental Mining Consortium, effective immediately. I have no obligations now except to my own conscience and heart." Ruby stared at the ring, its green depths capturing firelight in hypnotic patterns as Jackson continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "You've changed everything for me, Ruby. Shown me that success without integrity is merely cleverly disguised failure. Reminded me of the values my mother sacrificed to instill in me before ambition led me temporarily astray." He took her hand gently, his touch warm despite his rain-soaked condition. "I want to build something lasting together, not simply a business partnership, though I respect your entrepreneurial spirit beyond measure, but a life where we face each challenge and celebrate each triumph as equals." The formal proposal hung between them, momentous and unexpected despite the growing connection they'd shared for months. Ruby found herself unable to immediately respond, conflicting emotions rendering her temporarily speechless. "This is overwhelming," she finally managed, carefully extracting her hand from his. You've just confirmed you came here under false pretenses, yet in the same breath ask me to bind my future to yours. Jackson remained kneeling, accepting her reaction without defensiveness. I understand your hesitation. Trust, once questioned, requires time and evidence to rebuild. He closed the ring box, but held it extended toward her. I don't ask for an immediate answer, only that you consider the possibility that a mission begun in professional obligation transformed into something authentic and lasting. The humility in his request, not demanding immediate forgiveness, but acknowledging her right to uncertainty, touched Ruby despite her wariness. I need time, she said finally, to sort through all of this, to determine whether what lies between us can survive this revelation. Take whatever time you need. Jackson rose, placing the ring box on the mantelpiece before reluctantly stepping toward the door. I'll be at the Auburn Hotel until you reach your decision, however long that requires. At the parlor threshold, he turned back, vulnerability evident despite his composed expression. For what it's worth, Ruby, every moment of guidance, every piece of advice, every effort to help establish your roadhouse came from genuine care for your success, not consortium interests. My deception involved my original purpose here, never my feelings for you. After he departed into the storm, Ruby remained before the fire, eventually retrieving the ring box from the mantelpiece. Opening it again, she studied the emerald's facets in the firelight, turning it between her fingers as questions circled endlessly in her mind. Could feelings that began in calculation truly transform into something authentic? Did Jackson's resignation from the consortium represent genuine commitment to her, or merely a tactical adjustment when his original assignment proved unworkable? Most troubling of all, did her heart's undeniable response to him represent wisdom or weakness? The fire burned lower as Ruby sat weighing possibilities against risks, hope against experience. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, but the tempest within her thoughts continued unabated. Desire for connection battling hard-earned wariness, the emerald's green depths offering no answers as she turned it in fingers that alternately reached toward and withdrew from the decision that awaited her.